All right, good morning, members of the Capital Finance and Investment Committee. It is good to see you here in our Capitol on this beautiful June day. We will go ahead and get started with roll call.
For the Select Committee for Capital Financing and Investments on June 12th, Senator Beitman. Here. Senator Crum.
Here.
Senator Driscoll.
Here.
Senator Guru.
Here.
Senator Salazar.
Here.
Representative Haraldson.
Here.
Representative Nicholas.
Excused.
Representative Pendergraft.
Here.
Representative Storr. Here. Representative Wasserberger.
Here.
Vice Chairman Bear.
Here.
Chairman Nethercott.
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right, with that, we will move to adoption of our rules. Committee, you have on as part of your agenda proposed interim committee rules. It is my wish to adopt those rules, which requires an adoption or requires approval of a majority of both chambers. So separately, so a majority of the Senate or a majority of the House, in order for us to adopt legislation as a committee and move it forward. Any discussion on the proposed rules? Can I get a motion?
Madam.
Senator Gru.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So you need a vote from each body? Is that what I heard you say?
A majority vote from each
each body.
body in order to sponsor legislation.
So I would move adoption of the rules as presented in our meeting minutes, meeting materials packet dated today.
And for right now, for purposes of clarity of the discussion from the proposed rules as identified on our agenda, the item number 1 is what we're discussing. There's a number 2 on there for proxy and absentee voting. We'll get to that, which I also actually support. So, but just for clarity, further discussion on Senator Guru's motion. Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this particular adoption of this rule would mean that any 4 of us could basically have veto power over the rest of the body.
Good discussion, Representative Bear. Further discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed?
No?
No.
Roll call vote. I don't do the hands.
Roll call vote on the rules. Senator Beitman. Aye. Senator Crum.
Aye.
Senator Driscoll.
Aye.
Senator Guru.
Aye.
Senator Salazar.
Aye.
Representative Haraldson.
No.
Representative Nicholas. Excused. Representative Pendergraft.
No.
Representative Storr. Aye. Representative Wasserberger.
No.
Vice Chairman Bear.
No.
Chairman Nethercott.
Aye.
7 aye, 4 no, 1 excused.
All right, moving on to the second item concerning the rules, which is item number 2 on the proposed interim committee rules, which is proxy voting shall not be permitted, and neither is absentee voting. That is the chairman's prerogative, I believe. Mr. Shaw, is that correct?
Madam Chairman, that is correct, under the
And
manual
so
of legislative procedure.
that is what will be adopted. So there will be no proxy voting or absentee voting. With that, we will move forward with committee responsibilities and an overview of Title 28, Article 2. Mr. Shaw, welcome.
Madam Chairman, thank you. This is a topic that we discussed briefly at our interim topics meeting during the session, and I think we were all there, and I won't dwell on it for a long time. Unlike many of the other committees that are in front of the legislature, standing committees do have a charge in the statutes, and so it's pretty easy to tell what your duties are. Those are found in 28-11-201, which has been provided to you in your committee packets. The first provision talks about the appointment of the members, which of course has already happened. The subsection B talks about the mandates of the committee, those duties. They monitor the establishment and implementation of state investment policy by the State Loan and Investments Board, and including the extent to which investment goals are being achieved. The committee is to monitor and the establishment and implementation of state capital
Mr.
financing.
Shaw, can we have you get closer to your mic?
Oh, sure. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Monitor the establishment and implementation of state capital financing policy by the State Building Commission. This is a provision that, while applicable to the committee, we talked about this a couple of years ago in terms of whether it's still needed, because the fact is most of our projects are not accomplished through state capital financing. Nevertheless, it's an important procedure should the state start adopting those procedures. And at that time, I think 2 or 3 years ago, Chairman decided not to remove it from the statutes. The next one is prepare and submit recommendations to the legislature, including sponsoring legislation to improve statutes related to the investment of state and local government funds. That's, of course, a primary goal and activity of the committee for the last number of years. We need to develop knowledge and expertise among its members regarding issues related to investment of public funds and capital financing. Of course, we do that, and that's a big part of what we're be doing today. And we are to monitor state funds invested for a specific public purpose authorized or directed by the legislature. That's specifically contemplated in the Constitution and allowed under a statute under PPIs, or public purpose investments, which the state hasn't been as active in the last couple of years, but we still monitor that procedure should it be used. The statutes provide for some duties of the State Loan and Investments Board to provide information to this committee. And the Select Committee has some optional powers, which include securing consulting services for its activities, reviewing budgets and expenditures related to any aspect of state investment policy, or review budgets and expenditures related to any aspect of state capital financing policy. So that's it. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I won't.
Questions for Mr. Shaw? All right, seeing none, thank you, Mr. Shaw. Committee and folks in the room with us, it should be known that over here with the coffee station, there are the best donuts in the city available for your appreciation. So just know if you need a little pick-me-up with some sugar, those are available for you. With that, we are on time and under budget at 8:39 a.m. We will transition over to the treasurer's office. I see that the treasurer is here with us along with his team. Welcome, Treasurer Meyer, if you'd like to come forward.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. Joining me will be
Closer to the mic.
joining me will be Sam Daly, and is my policy person. And a little bit about Sam. She came on after Matt Sackett and is doing, I think, a great job. Got a good experience in legislative matters and does hold a law degree. So she's a sharp individual. You know, she's doing a great job. And Norm LeBlanc, he's our Chief Operating Officer, and primarily has different duties, and they're getting more and more every day because we're taking advantage of his wide and varied skill sets.
All right, well, welcome. I see we have a PowerPoint presentation for us to provide an overview. Ms. Daly, will you be presenting?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, welcome, great.
Thank you. My name is Samantha Daly, and I am the Senior Policy Advisor in the State Treasurer's Office. Today, I'm going to provide a look at the investment of state funds by the Treasurer's Office, including our work with outside consultants, the Investment Funds Committee, and the State Loan and Investment Board. And I do have some slides whenever we have a chance to get those up. Are you not presenting your slides? I was not planning to, no. Okay, thank you.
Does that mean I can go get coffee now? Okay.
As we wait for those slides, I just would like to congratulate the committee for everyone following the interim committee rules and being dressed appropriately in suits and ties. So here's to kudos to the Capital Finance and Investment Committee. I appreciate the effort that went into that this morning and your ability to show up looking like good professionals in the Wyoming legislature. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. It looks like the slides are up. If we could go to the second slide. So I'll start with a broad overview of our office. There are 5 key areas in which we operate to serve Wyoming. There is high-level agency administration, of course, but we also have 4 narrower areas, which include the investment of state funds, banking and cash management, distributions, and the state unclaimed property program. Today, like I said, we will be going into some detail regarding the investment of state funds piece. Next slide, please. So you might ask, why bother investing state funds? We do this because state investment earnings are profit for the state of Wyoming, and like a business, we view profitability as a positive for the government and for the people of this state. Investment earnings currently make up 1/3 of the general fund revenue, and as you know, we rely on the general fund to pay for necessary government functions and services. To best serve the people of Wyoming, we need a robust general fund, and having a strong investment approach helps us to achieve that. Next slide. So how do we generate those earnings to support a general fund? We have to evaluate investment opportunities with the goal of achieving the best possible returns. This means we exclusively consider which investments offer the highest return on a risk-adjusted basis. We do not look at other non-pecuniary factors. As our Chief Operating Officer will discuss later this morning, we operate under an investment policy statement, or IPS, and that specifically includes an ESG policy, which requires that only financial factors be given consideration in our analysis. You'll recall that that policy was actually codified during the most recent legislative session with Senate File 191. Additionally, our office also maintains the most conservative proxy management protocols that are available. Again, our COO will be able to provide some additional color with regard to proxies. We recognize our fiduciary responsibility to the people of Wyoming, and we work to employ a strategy that will generate long-term prosperity for the state. That strategy also includes asset allocation and manager selection considerations, so I will discuss those concepts now in some greater detail. Next slide, please. So asset allocation. This drives up to 95% of fund returns, and that tells you right off that we want to give asset allocation some serious attention. Working with our consultant, RVK, the Treasurer's Office will propose an asset allocation consistent with specific pool objectives. The proposal is then reviewed by the Investment Funds Committee, which is also known as the IFC, and they will then provide their recommendation to the State Loan and Investment Board, better known as SLIB. It is the role of the SLIB to approve our proposed asset allocation. This is an annual process, and at its meeting last week, the SLIB did vote to approve the asset allocation recommendations. No changes to the strategic asset allocation policies were recommended this year, but it was recommended that we pursue a continued progression to approved targets as detailed in our existing pacing schedule. Next slide. So the returns that we seek obviously represent some lofty aspirations, and that's why it's wonderful that we have a talented team of investment professionals who are dedicated to making those goals a reality for our office and for the state of Wyoming. Along with asset allocation, one of the key considerations for our team is manager selection. And I'll start with the big picture, considering a broad universe of managers in specific asset classes, who they'll then narrow down and conduct due diligence for the narrowed down list. Next slide, please. So in selection of an investment manager, there are a number of factors that will be considered. This slide provides a sample of those factors. As I mentioned earlier, our primary concern is achieving the highest return on a risk-adjusted basis. So to that end, we want to look at both historical track record and the anticipated future returns for a manager. Naturally, the manager's investment strategy and their philosophy are also important considerations we want to take a look at, as is the makeup of their management team and the fee structure. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier with respect to asset allocation, in addition to our internal process for manager selection, the State Treasurer's Office also works closely with outside investment consultants. This collaboration is provided for in our IPS. I previously spoke a bit about our work with RVK, and we also work with a consultant by the name of Axia on real estate. In addition to collaborating directly with our internal staff on asset allocation and manager selection, RVK also does present regular investment performance updates to the SLIB. Next slide, please. So as I've alluded to throughout this discussion, we have additional checkpoints in place once the investment team communicating with our consultant has selected a manager. So the first of these checkpoints is the IFC, which is created by Wyoming Statute Section 9-4-720. Per statute, the IFC is responsible for the review of state investment policies and procedures, monitoring alternative investments, and recommending investment benchmarks. Prospective managers are presented at IFC meetings by members of our investment team and our consultant. A manager must receive the IFC's recommendation. If they do, the matter will next be considered by the SLIB. The SLIB has statutory authority to approve the hiring of investment managers, and this approval process typically occurs at the regular meetings of the SLIB, which are currently held the first Thursday of each even-numbered month. As at the IFC meetings, members of our investment team will appear with our investment consultant to present the prospective manager to the SLIB. A member of the IFC will also appear to explain the IFC's recommendation. The SLIB will then vote on approval of the manager, and at last week's meeting, the SLIB voted to approve 3 of 3 proposed new managers. Next slide, please. So wrapping up here, Wyoming was selected as the #1 sovereign wealth fund in transparency in the United States. That was an analysis done by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And we take pride in our process and in the success of our team. We are always available to speak with legislators and answer any questions you might have. And I want to let everyone know our website is also a great resource to get more information about what we do in our office. We also publish a number of reports online. There are 16 annual reports that the legislature has requested of our office, and each of those can be found on the website. The RVK performance updates I touched on earlier can also be found online, as can our proxy votes. I appreciate your time today, and I would be happy to take any questions before passing things over to my colleague for a discussion of our investment policies.
Questions for Ms. Daly? All right, seeing none. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Okay, Norm.
Mr. Norm?
Good
Mr.
morning,
LeBlanc.
Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, and committee members. My name is Norman LeBlanc, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the State Treasurer's Office. It's a pleasure to appear before you today and provide a high-level view of our investment policies. If we can get the presentation back up, this is slide 11 on that presentation. So STO's investment policies are contained within a publicly available document that we call the Investment Policy Statement, or generally the IPS. That's an acronym you'll hear. The fiscal year 2025 IPS is available on the Treasurer's Office website and remains effective through June 30 of 2025. The fiscal year 2026 IPS was approved by the SLIB on June 5th and will be effective July 1, 2025. That also will be posted on or about the effective date on the Treasurer's website. As stated in the IPS, SDO's overall investment objective is to achieve the highest return on a risk-adjusted basis. Nothing more, nothing less. Of course, each investment strategy will have additional objectives that range from preservation of capital for the state agency pool, which is basically a short-term checking account for 400+ agencies, to growth for a long-term permanent fund. If we could go to slide 12, please. So what's in the IPS? Well, In short, the IPS provides the investment parameters within which the STO must operate. The fiscal year 2025 IPS consists of 21 sections, 7 appendices, and spans 43 pages. A broad range of investment topics are addressed in the IPS, including investment objectives, fiduciary responsibilities, ethics, ESG standards, permissible investments, risk management, and proxy guidelines, to name a few. Importantly, the IPS sets out the target asset allocation for each investment strategy and defines the benchmarks against which performance is measured. You might think of the IPS as a user manual for investments. If anyone, a member of this group, a member of the public, wants to know what percentage of a long-term permanent fund can be invested in equities, you can find the allowable range and the target allocation in the IPS. Simply look it up on the web. Wonder what minimum credit rating is for bonds in a fixed income strategy? You can find the minimum credit rating and in fact how to calculate it in the IPS. If we could move to the next slide, please. So how is the IPS amended and approved each year? The IPS undergoes a thorough review on an annual basis. Our investment team, working collaboratively with RVK, develops a proposed asset allocation for each of the investment strategies. In addition, both RVK and the investment team review each of the performance benchmarks and propose changes as needed. Our COO also reviews the IPS and proposes changes that bring the IPS language in sync with market practice. The amended IPS is reviewed and debated by the IFC. The document is then re-edited to reflect any agreed changes, and the IFC votes to recommend the IPS to the SLIB. That's followed by a joint IFC-SLIB working session where the SLIB takes a very deep dive into asset allocation, benchmark selection, and the IPS as a whole. For purposes of this meeting, RVK, acting as the investment consultant to SLIB, presents the proposed changes and provides their recommendation to approve the proposed IPS. No vote is taken at this meeting. This is a working session. SLIB then votes to approve the IPS at a subsequent regularly scheduled meeting. That wraps up a very high-level view of the IPS. We thank the committee for their time, and we'll stand for any questions.
All right, questions of Mr. LeBlanc? All right, seeing none, thank you. All right, any comments from the treasurer at this point?
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for that opportunity. I think you can see that this is an organizational structure that takes care of the investments of the state. It's not a one-man shop. And this has been 6 years coming as far as what we had to do to get from where we were, which is in the last quartile or even the last person in our peer group in performance, to where we're actually in the top quartile now. And in the 3-year area of investments, we're actually number one in the quartile between all of our peer group. And the amount of money that we've made to date is well over $1 billion in alpha. Now, what alpha is just excess of what you think you're going to get out of the market index and over your benchmarks. And that is done essentially by totally restructuring, with the help of the legislature, as far as allowing us the opportunity to do it, our whole operation into the divisions that were mentioned. And giving us the capacity in personnel and giving us the opportunity to move in new capabilities for every person in every position. And one of the things that we do that's maybe a little bit of different from some of the states is that we actually, in certain areas, we do skills tests of the people that we onboard. So we know that when they come in and sit in their seat, and everybody on the floor knows that everybody's got each other's back. And it's an operation and a group of individuals that I take great pride personally in what they do for the state. What our job is to put a smile on everybody's face every day by making sure that in the unclaimed properties division, that people are getting money back, and put a smile on all the agencies' face and hopefully the legislators by making sure that we've got the funds to do your job, and that's to provide, I think, a better future for the people in Wyoming. So it's a great team effort, and it's just not one person doing it, but it's this organizational structure. And I hope that we can look at looking at some of the things that are coming in constitutional amendments and try to make sure that organizational structure stays. So I hear a lot of times that what happens if you have a rogue treasurer or somebody that comes in and what's going to happen. I think that, and this was actually brought about by a suggestion that Senator Nethercott had on working with on one of these to actually make sure that we put into the Constitution the structure where we have the state treasurer and the state treasurer's office actually in this structure actually doing the job that it can do and has done, and making sure that it'll continue to be that way. So thank you, Senator Nethercott, for that suggestion. So we look forward to talking about it later.
All right, thank you, Treasurer. With that, we will transition to the Wyoming retirement system. Welcome, Director Swindell and team. All right, committee, we are on agenda item 2.2-3 from the Wyoming retirement system. Director Swindell, welcome to CapFin.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, my name is David Swindell. I'm the Executive Director of your Wyoming retirement system. I'm joined at the dais by our General Counsel, Ben Brandis, and on my right, your left, is our Chief Investment Officer, Sam Masudi. We're not going to throw a bunch of PowerPoint slides at you. I think the Treasurer has done a good job of that. In the end, I just want to emphasize the similarities between Treasury and us, and a few differences that are important for all the legislators and all the members of the public to understand. I think the first thing is of course we both have investment operations, but ours is a little is different and it is separate. It's an $11.5 billion fund that is a single purpose fund, unlike some of the complications that Norm just displayed to you in cash management and various funds that the Treasury has. We have one fund with its sole purpose for the exclusive benefit of the members of the pension system. That exclusive benefit thought is contained in the state constitution. It's also contained in Treasury regulations from the Department of Treasury. We're a tax-advantaged pension fund organized under Section 401A of the IRS Code. So exclusive benefit, single-purpose fund. We don't have any mandates about interest and dividends and corpus. To us, a dollar is a dollar, whether it's earned in capital gains, interest, or dividends, and we manage the fund as a single entity. Now, we do have 8 defined benefit plans that we administer, but they all share in a pooled arrangement for investment purposes. What happens is, for example, I think the committee is well aware that the big public plan has all the public employees in the state, teachers, all the general employees, makes up about 88% of our population in business. And then we have the smaller plans for public safety and judges. So if you're the law enforcement plan and you make up, say, 3% of the assets at the beginning of the month, contributions come in, benefits go out, administrative expenses are paid, and then for the month, there's an investment gain or loss. And that fund will get 3% of that investment gain. And then you reset the table. Maybe they're 3.1% of the assets at the beginning of the next month, and then we just roll on from there. But from Sam's perspective, and perspective of the investment operation, they don't care about that. They manage the pension fund as a single fund because all these funds have a little different flow of money, a little different situation with their funding status, but similar enough so they're invested in a similar investment posture. So single-purpose fund, and it's administered that way. The other thing to understand is that Wyoming statute establishes the Wyoming Retirement Board as the entity with exclusive authority over administration and operation of the retirement system, and establishes the board to act as the investment trustee. So all the power is invested in the Wyoming Retirement Board. That board consists of the elected state treasurer, Kurt Meyer, that you just heard from. He is 1/11 of my boss. I have the other members of the board are appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate. It includes 5 people that have some association with the system, 2 people from the education community, 2 people not from the education community, and 1 retiree. The other 5 members, as a balance, are people that have no connection with the system. They're simply citizens of Wyoming that help oversight the system on behalf of all of us. So an 11-person board, and they have sole authority. It is not an advisory board. This is a real operations board that has real responsibilities and has real authority to carry out those responsibilities. They hire the executive director, and they can fire the executive director. And the authority I have is delegated from the board, and they can change that delegation. In turn, I hired the chief investment officer and all the staff to get the work done of the retirement system, both from an administrative standpoint, serving our members, and from an investment standpoint, investing the $11.5 billion under management for the exclusive benefit of our members. So the board operates these days with a philosophy of nose in, fingers out. They establish an investment policy statement. Ours is 16 pages long, and like Treasury's, it delineates various aspects of the investment program to include the asset allocation, the risk appetite, the ranges, how much we're going to have in public equities, plus or minus X%, the limitations on liquidity, limitations on credit quality, all the things that you would expect and are contained in the Treasury's investment policy statement are contained in ours. The board operates with an investment committee. It's a subcommittee of the retirement board that includes people with experience. By legislation, we're required to have 2 members with institutional investment experience. We have that. I can go through the resumes of that, but we really have about 4 people, arguably, on the board that have institutional investment experience, including some very good experience on Wall Street. It's the nature of having some retired folks in Jackson Hole these days. So the board establishes the investment policy statement, and the investment committee monitors the investment program. The chairman of the investment committee monitors, so we have a weekly investment call. The investment committee meets periodically during a quarter, usually at least once, but usually 2 or 3 times as a committee prior to the quarterly board meetings. At the quarterly board meetings, the entire board is involved with the investment team. The board hires an independent investment consultant to guide them in their efforts. You will hear from them this afternoon. Mika Malone and Nick Erickson will be here from Makita Investments, and they provide detailed reports on the performance of the system, and they work for the board. They don't work for Sam and I. And so in the end, you wind up with a structure that allows firm guidance from the board, but within that, we have some independent authority. If the team has developed an investment idea and we think we want to put $100 million with a given manager in an asset class, we do our investigation. We have our attorney, Ben Brandis, is very skilled in this over the years, has been doing this for a long time, negotiates a investment management agreement. Usually it starts with a non-disclosure agreement so we can get into the knickers and details of the proprietary strategy that the investment manager typically has and so on. And we wind up with a proposal to make an investment that's vetted across the entire team that Sam has. And in the end, I'm the one that has to approve that. But it stays within the agency. The board doesn't approve it. We have independent authority to move money in that regard within the guidance of the IPS, and that means that we can be a little more nimble. And that means we can react to markets, because as you know, markets can move pretty quickly. So that's the basic structure. So single-purpose fund, exclusive benefit, board's in charge, board delegates, board has a mechanism to do that with the investment team, hires professionals, and monitors the activities of those professionals closely. That's the basic thing that the committee should understand. The other thing that I put in the memo that's in your packet, there's a little color-coded diagram there that looks kind of impressive. What I had is I had our investment consultants, Mika and Nick, give me some numbers going back 25 years of the investment results.
Director Swindell, I'm going to stop you right there, and I'm going to ask staff to put that up on the screen if we can. It's on that tab 3 that we're on that they have provided as part of their memorandum. It's on that very first page, and it's a pretty compelling and pretty diagram. So I think it'd be useful for the public to be able to see that live streamed and for it to be on the big screens here in the room, because I have some questions I'd just like to highlight about it as well. So we'll give that a minute.
We'll just wait a moment for that to come up. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I like the diagram too. Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. So, Madam Chairman, what this little diagram is, I had Mika and Eric go back and give us results and average over those over 5 years and give me 25 years of that. And so what you see here on the diagram is the performance of the fund in 5-year increments starting in the year 2000. Because I want to point out to the committee that the arrangement that I just described to you wasn't always that way. Back in the early part of the decades, through about 2009, the board did not employ any investment professionals. There wasn't any SAM. The board was selecting individual fund managers. I think in a 2007 audit, the board was managing a portfolio of 14 different bond and stock managers. And the activities of a board meeting would typically be kind of a beauty contest where a prospective manager would come in and give a pitch as to why they ought to be hired. The results weren't very good, and that's the red stuff you see there. You can see that the second line there, the first line, from January 2000 to December 2004, the pension fund earned an average of 2.49% average every year. That wasn't very good. That ranked us in the 86th percentile of peer funds. Peer funds being a universe of about 100 endowment and pension funds with assets over $1 billion. The median fund did much better, 3.81, and we calculated some numbers on the base. The average balance was about $4.7 billion back then, and we left $315 million on the table compared to just an average median fund performance. The position of Chief Investment Officer first appears on the organizational chart of the Wyoming Retirement System in December of 2009. It is vacant. Mr. Vacant didn't work very hard. But eventually, we did hire our first Chief Investment Officer. Trent May came on board. We didn't have him for very long because we didn't pay him a whole lot of money, and he needed to move on in his career. But he established the initial structure to have some investment professionals start managing the fund, and the structure that I described to you started to evolve. Sam Masudi was hired as our Chief Investment Officer in late December 2013, began operating in 2014. And with the help of the legislature, including some people in this room, we began to build out the investment team that Sam envisioned, which pretty much became in place by late 2016, that consisted of 3 analysts, 3 senior investment officer, 1 investment officer kind of in between, and 1 chief investment officer. So we had a team of 8 professionals to manage the system, and they began to operate.
Director Swindell, because I like to name names, the people in this room, are you referring to Representative Nicholas?
I am, Madam Chairman.
I thought that might be the case. I know he's worked hard on these issues over the years. Please proceed, Director.
So the team began to evolve, and with the addition of performance compensation in 2019, which the good representative was also heavily involved in, Now, our base salaries, which are now established in statute, are basically still bottom quartile in the, amongst peer funds. But with performance compensation, they get close to median in most of the categories. So it's been a very successful program, and I think the structure has proven itself. And you can see it in the results on this chart. You can see we didn't do very well for the first 10 years. And then we started to evolve. It took a few years to get the people in place and to get them established. But in the last 10 years, and especially the last 5 years, you can see that we ranked, in the last 5 years, we ranked in the 3rd percentile of peer funds. This is like golf. Low scores are better. That means we were better than 97% of the funds out there. And you can see the difference in performance. We averaged 8.77% over that time period. The median fund only averaged 6.93, and that difference on an average balance of $10.4 billion was $963 million, nearly $1 billion in outperformance compared to an average fund, let alone compared to a bottom quartile fund, which we were a bottom feeder in the first part of the decade. So the lesson to me, and I hope the lesson to the public and to everybody in the room, is that A, governance matters. Sometimes the best way to exercise your responsibilities is to delegate that within guardrails and let the professionals run. The second thing you get out of that is investments in the investment team and the administrative budget have paid off. And that resourcing the investment operation is essential, and that has produced millions of dollars. So sometimes we get into arguments about whether we should add one more analyst to the team. That might cost us $84,000 a year, and we might pay that person some performance pay in addition to, and we wrangle over that. But in the end, if that helps the team produce these kinds of results, you can see that a small investment, and all the investments we've put in so far, have really paid off. So that's, if there's anything, so it's a really good news story. It's a partnership with the legislature, partnership with many of the people in this room. If there's a shortcoming to bear in mind, it did take a while to get there. And maybe it should have been a little faster. But that was then, and we are where we're at, and we're in a good place. So, Madam Chairman, that concludes my remarks, subject to any questions from you or members of the committee, unless, Ben, do you have any comments from a legal perspective and the structure? There's Appendix B that lists all the different statutes and things that we're governed by, but I don't know if we need to get into that.
Ben, would you like to give us an overview of the statutes?
I'm sure that's what everyone wants, Madam Chair. Ben Brandis, General Counsel. Director Swindell's done an excellent job describing the structure of this and the history. And anything I say isn't going to be nearly as fun as these performance returns. But I would like to emphasize that we certainly believe, and I think it's important for everyone to understand, Wyoming has a very robust structure, statutory structure, and control structure for the retirement funds. It emanates from the Constitution, Article 19, Section 11, which is the exclusive benefit rule. The fiduciary responsibilities for the board emanate from that constitutional provision. We have a very competent and active board, as the director described, that have given Sam and his team the tools that they need under our legal construct and statutory construct to really be effective and implement these things. So I certainly stand by for questions if there are questions on any of the statutes or the legal provisions.
Yeah, big picture, I just have a question. It is a bit surprising that it took us so long to understand that we needed actual investment professionals to be managing our pension funds. I'm pretty disappointed in that history. But instead of dwelling on the past, but really focusing on where we are today, how similar or dissimilar are we to other states' retirement system structures? Generally, it's a broad question, I know.
Madam Chair. So there are a number of similarities in terms of the investment process. I think we're pretty typical. I think that the budget process is probably most different, I think. And many public pensions, the board determines the budget because it's the members' money and the board represents the members and their independence. So that's a good check. Having the legislature determine the budget and head count, things like that is a little bit more unusual. I guess maybe 10% of public pensions do that, but that's probably the biggest difference that we have.
All right, great. Any additional questions for Representative Wasserberger?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question for you guys. I was reading somewhere along the packet that there's a state statute requirement for a 50% allocation into treasury notes. Is that a requirement that you guys have to follow, having a 50% allocation of that, or are you able to diversify more than that? And if you do have to follow that, do you go by a higher allocation? And what do you guys allocate specifically to that?
Madam Chair, Representative Wasserberger. Yeah, so in our IPS, we have an asset allocation similar to Treasury that lays out all the different asset classes and the composition of those, what can be invested and what can't be invested in, and then it has various limits. But the 50% Treasury limit, I'm trying to think where, I don't know where you saw that necessarily, but we do have an allocation to government bonds and then other subclasses within fixed income.
Thank you. So you don't currently have a mandate on what has to be allocated to that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Wasserberger, let me pull up the investment policy statement. And if you go to page 7, that shows the government debt subclass as a 6.5% target, then has a range of 4 to 13%.
And Madam Chairman, Representative Wasserberger, that allocation and that decision is established by the board.
Thank you.
All right, any additional questions for the retirement system and their structure? Representative Nicholas, any comments?
Madam Chairman, my only comment is, Dave, Sam, you guys are doing a great job. And it's just nice to be able to have the ability to listen to such great news. So keep up the good work.
All right, thank you. All right, so we are still on agenda item number 2 for the morning. We will round it back out with the adopted investment policies, I think, and we have Mr. LeBlanc. Did we cover some of that this morning, or do you have additional this morning to go over?
Madam Chair, we covered that this morning.
Okay, great. I thought that might be the case. Thanks for being efficient in seeing that on the agenda. Director?
Madam Chairman, the Wyoming Retirement System also has its investment policy statement, also is in your packet. We'll stand for any questions on that.
Yeah, questions on the investment policy in the packet? All right, seeing none, great job. All right, and now we will go to our guiding statutes from LSO staff. Mr. Shah? And then after this committee, we'll take a brief break, our morning break, just get some more coffee, donuts, and bathroom time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, obviously, what you have in front of you is a packet that has a lot of information in it. So I'm not going to try to go through this and explain every provision, because that's, you know, the entirety of the investment of the state, which is too complex for the purposes today. But a couple of things. First of all,
Mr. Shaw, is this tab 3-1?
I believe it is. Yes. Yeah. Karen, can you confirm that?
I believe so.
It is. 3-01?
It was 2-01.
And I would note that this is a slightly different, although you won't see anything different from what you see on the web is the current version, but I did revise this and added some provisions from the first packet that was distributed, and I believe Karen has already given you that improved version. Really, the difference you'll notice right off the bat in the version you're looking at should start with constitutional provisions rather than statutory provisions. So really, the purpose is to you've already got a pretty good idea of what the investment strategies and structures are from both our WRS and the Wyoming State Treasurer's Office, and some of the individual parts of those strategies and structures. And so the idea is to put just a kind of a beginning idea in your mind of what our statutes and our Constitution say about those very things. Again, I can't go through all the provisions one by one. That would take a long time. But at least this way, if you kind of know that there's a statute or constitutional provision when it comes of interest to you, otherwise you have a resource. And I think that's what this document will provide if later these issues come up, and they will. I'll also say that the version of the statute and some of the constitutional provisions you have here aren't necessarily complete because I redacted them. Irrelevant provisions are left out. So you might see that they skip subsections, et cetera. That's because we only included the relevant provisions. So I'm going to start with the first page, and it provides some of the constitutional provisions that are relevant to what we do, including the investment authority of these entities, which is important because it often comes up in this committee about what the investment authority is and what they are allowed to invest in. And although I'm not going to go page by page, I am going to start with a fairly specific discussion on page 1 of Article 16, Section 6, only because it's so important. In the provisions that are described there, it provides the authority to invest in equities and stocks of corporations for the permanent funds and the retirement funds for the state of Wyoming. And we're going to talk about that in a minute with regard to in our education session that Polly will be giving you. But there's a difference between permanent funds of the state and those other statutory funds of the state that aren't necessarily permanent. The permanent funds are created by our Constitution and our Act of Admission, and we have a limited ability to mess with those or otherwise adjust how they're handled. So if it's a permanent fund, we're allowed to invest it in stocks and equities. The second provision there says that funds not designated as permanent, however, can also be invested in stock or equities upon the action of the legislature by a 2/3 vote. We've done that several times the last couple of years. We've opened up what we can invest in with sideboards, but you've noticed like last session, there were several votes that required a 2/3 vote, and that's because they were operating under this constitutional provision. Finally, again, relevant to what we did last year, at the bottom of that page, we talk about the legislature may provide for an investment of local government funds also in stocks and equities. We did that last year. We'll get an update at this meeting today, but that also required a 2/3 vote. So when you have questions about, how we're operating under that authority, that's because the Constitution provides for these investments of at least the permanent funds and the other ones as we declare. On the second page, there is an Article 15, Section 19, which discusses and establishes the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund, because that's one of the largest fund that we have that we invest in. It's a topic of discussion often in front of this committee. And there are constitutional mandates for that, as well as what the investment funds, the funds that are invested, the earnings from those investments go to the general fund to provide for the general operation of government.
And Mr. Shaw, recognizing I think this particular fund is one of our largest funds, can you provide, if you know, a brief history on when it was established and why?
Well, that's interesting. I'm not prepared to give you a great answer on that, perhaps others in the room, but I believe it was established, and I'm going to take a stab here, which I shouldn't, 1971 or thereabouts. It was to capture severance taxes. And that has predominantly been the funding mechanism of the general fund through the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund. All severance taxes, or the constitutional amount of severance taxes, are deposited to that fund where it becomes inviolate, which means that those funds that once they're in there are deposited into the fund, they can't be spent. Rather, they're invested, and the investment earnings are what is spent from those. And you're going to find that that's a common method for us to do things. We have a number of permanent funds, and Polly's going to talk about that next, that where we deposit them into an inviolate fund, and only the earnings or interest or earnings, et cetera, from those funds are then allowed to be expended on the programs they support.
Mr. Shaw, if you know, the impetus for this fund was pretty dire to my recollection of Wyoming history. Do you recall, or anyone from LSO recall, how much money Wyoming had in its accounts prior to the creation of the Wyoming Permanent Mineral Trust Fund?
Madam Chair, I should let someone else answer that, but it wasn't very much. Polly, do you have an answer to that one?
Madam Chairman, I do not have a specific answer, but it was very low, very alarmingly low amount of money.
I think we're going to find out before our break ends and we come back this morning. For those of you who have access to the great oracle known as the internet, I encourage you to Google that. And so we have a clear understanding for all of the Wyoming legislators in the room, all of those responsible for investing our state dollars, how fundamentally dire the state of Wyoming was simply 60 years ago. And so the critical importance of our savings and our permanent funds to the future of this state can be no more clearer than the impetus for the creation of the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. So I expect to have an overview of that in about 20 minutes. Mr. Shaw, please proceed.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm still on page 2. Under the heading School Funds, the rest of those constitutional provisions discuss the school funds, and there are a number of them, but that's because there are a number of school funds that are dedicated to the support of our public schools and to higher education. And these constitutional provisions have then led to the creation of permanent funds and that are non-violent and inviolate and are perform in much the same way as the Wyoming Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. Those include the Higher Education Trust Fund indicated on page 3. The only other constitutional provision that is included here is the one that refers to the retirement funds, Article 19, Section 11, and it is, and indeed also is something that the Treasurer's Office alluded to. The Wyoming Retirement System alluded to. After those constitutional provisions, we get into the statutory law. And of course, the statutory law is fairly voluminous compared to the constitutional provisions because it gets a lot more into the details. I might, remind the committee that there are many details in statute, and the general investment structure, as well as the standards for what and how those, and the fiduciary standards for those people that are invested are included in the statutes. But as was indicated earlier, many of the fine details about the exact allocation of assets, et cetera, are found in those investment policy statements. And so those are the best way to turn when you have specific examples. For example, Representative, your question about specific allocation to government funds, that can be found in those investment policy statements, and they are very helpful and very specific. And I might add more readable than I would think. I've actually gone to them before, and I actually understand them, and I'm not a finance guy, so you can read those and get something out of them. On page 4, we start with 94201, which statutorily creates a lot of these permanent funds that are mentioned in the statute, including the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund, the Permanent Land Fund, which relates to education, the Permanent Land Income Fund, which is education related, of course, the Excellence in Higher Education Endowment Fund, the Hathaway Student Scholarship Endowment Fund, the Hathaway Expand Wyoming Scholarship Endowment, and the Wyoming Tomorrow Scholarship. Those are all education-related permanent funds. I'm on page 5, and this is important because this starts the discussion of the statutes in Title IX, and that was alluded to earlier, but 94714 through 94722 are really the meat of the requirements related to those funds that are invested by the State Treasurer's Office. And I'll go through those here because I've included almost all of those here because they're all relevant to our discussions. First of all, we have definitions. Next time you're wondering what the heck is a permanent fund because, somebody talked about it and I don't remember, we actually have a definition in this section, which is really helpful to remember which of those are, and predominantly then those are also constitutionally created and guided. On 715 on page 6, we start with the appointment, the authority to appoint a chief investment officer. Page 7, under those same statutes, we talk about investment authority of permanent funds and the ability to invest in alternative investments, including the processes and approval of those alternative investments. Throughout the statutes, not just in one place, but the statutes address in numerous places the duties of the persons who invest about such things. And you'll hear about this in this committee, about the prudent investor rule, about the evaluation of risks and the ability to take risks, because the investment in stocks and equities always involves the assumption of some risks. And the statutes acknowledge that needs to be balanced. The need for a high return needs to be balanced with the associated risk with those high returns. So the statutes talk about that, talk about diversification and prudent risk taking. At the bottom of page 8 in subsection N, we talk about those public purpose investments that I mentioned earlier. Those are under our Constitution, the legislature is allowed to take part of the monies from the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund and invest those in PPIs or public purpose investments. But then that has to be done with legislative action. And once it's done, we are statutorily required to monitor those investments. And the State Treasurer's Office reports to us annually on the performance of those investments and how they're being repaid. Again, these are relevant, and that's happened, in the last 10 and 20 years a number of times. But recently, the legislature has not been active making those public purpose investments. On page 9, we talk about Pool A. You're going to hear about this a bit, in that Pool A is a designation of a certain number of funds that get to be pooled together for the purpose of investment. These were predominantly smaller funds, although some of them relatively sizable, but smaller funds but then when pooled together could be invested in equities and stocks of corporations to provide a little better return. Recently, the committee has been fairly active in adjusting that list. We've put some things on and taken a number of things off of funds off that list. And I believe it was last year, the year before, we now require that the minimum size of a fund is $5 million. That way you don't have smaller funds that really have liquidity needs that don't allow it to be invested for any sort of a longer term. At the bottom of page 10 in subsection Q, we talk about the LSRA and the investment authority and standards for investment of the LSR, the Legislative Reserve Account. In the bottom of page 11, and we'll talk about this a little bit here during my presentation, but more during Polly's presentation, a discussion of the reserve accounts that we have. And the reserve accounts are related primarily to spending policies. And what we do is we set aside some money in a reserve account from excess earnings to provide for payment in years that returns on investments are low. And what that allows us to do is, over an extended period of time, is even out the expenditure authority and the ability of these programs to have money to expend, rather than making it just subject to the annual fluctuations in the market. So that's the purpose of these reserve accounts. And the provision in R on page 11 is the investment authority of both the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund reserve account and the Common School account reserve account. It allows those to be invested in stocks and equities. I heard it referenced a couple of times in the prior presentations. And at the top of page 12, we talk about the investment authority and place some standards that you're going to see reoccur over and over in the statutes. It's at the very top of page 12, and it talks about investment authority, and in the investment policy statements, the purpose is to preserve the balance of each account in a manner that strives for the highest possible risk-adjusted total net return consistent with the appropriate level of safety and liquidity. And I just bring that out for you because that is another issue that's just raised over and over. What is the standard for our investments? What can we do? What losses can we take? They wrap back into that language, and that very similar identical language is stated throughout these statutes as the standard for overall standard for our investment and overall standards for those investment policies. So on page 12, it's important, 94716 is the statute that relates to investment policy statements. And I think that's already been, discussed in some length, so I won't go over it, but they're adopted by the State Loan and Investments Board with a lot of input from the investment IFC or Investment Funds Committee. They do require annual review, and this committee regularly gets updates and understands what those investment policies are doing. So these statutes give quite a bit of structure to those investment policy statements. That's page 12, 13, and 14. I'll bring up on page 14 in subsection E, there's an important part, and there was a discussion earlier again about what we needed to do in fixed assets, government fixed assets. It's interesting, in subsection E, we talk about the split of investment in fixed income investments versus stocks and equities. And I think many people in the investment world have heard of like the 70-30 rule, where there's limits on, we just can't put all of our money into the stock market and call it good. And a couple of years ago, we adjusted this statement, and the new standard is that your investments shall not materially exceed a risk profile of a reference profile that consists of 70% global equities and 30% domestic fixed income. So this is like the 70-30 rule in operation, except for that rather than requiring a strict 70-30% rule, it's the risk profile that would be the equivalent of that. That gives the investment, and I should let them talk about that more than I do, but it gives them some ability, some flexibility, and hard rules at 730 don't allow us to maximize our investment returns like this risk profile does. And I think 3 years ago or 4 years ago, we adopted this standard. Let's see, on page 15, 74718 talks about investment managers, their selection, approval, qualifications, and the reporting requirements. That was discussed quite a bit, and you're going to hear from our investment managers frequently in the committee, giving reports on performance, et cetera. Okay, and on page 17, this is the important part I think that we're going to have quite a few discussions about in this meeting, and this is the discussion of our spending policies. I kind of summarized earlier that we set up reserve accounts, and we fund these reserve accounts with excess earnings and then use those reserves to backfill when earnings are low and when they're insufficient to meet the spending obligations, the various programs that the funds support. So here we provide these reserve accounts and provide this backflow to preserve a constant level of funding each year rather than making it just fluctuate back and forth with the market. These specific statutes talk about the spending policies for the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, the Common School Permanent Land Fund, which again is education related, and the Excellence in Higher Education Endowment. So that's in these portion in 94719. I would say, however, some funds have their own spending policies. Specifically, and we'll discuss this later, last year, we adopted spending policies both for the Cultural Trust Fund and the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Fund. So some of those spending policies are not in this provision of the statutes, but are related to the specific statutes related to this programs. Let's see what else we have here. Okay, on page 21 in subsection P, we talk about the obligation of this committee to review spending policy amounts annually. And in fact, the Treasurer's Office and the Investment Funds Committee give us recommendations every year whether we need to change our spending policies. We'll talk about the purpose of those changes later. In the last several years, there have not been changes to our spending policies, and most of them currently are based on a value of the fund, which is usually 5% of the 5-year average value of the fund. And the relevant figure there is right now they're set at 5%. That is assuming, through the mechanism of investment, is that your investment earnings on average over a number of years are going to return at least 5%, hopefully more, and the excess amounts are tipped back into the trust. We'll talk about that some more, but that's basically what that concept is about. And this statute requires review of those annually to make sure that those spending policies are accurate. On page 22, the statute 94720 talks about the Investments Funds Committee and how it's created and what their various duties are, who the members are and how they're appointed, et cetera. On 94721, on page 23, talks about the selection panel. And I don't think that was mentioned, but a selection panel is, that is also each member is appointed by one of the top 5 electeds, is actually used to then appoint members to the IFC. So you have a separate entity that appoints a member to the IFC to make investment decisions. And that's all described at page 23 and in that statute. The last thing I'll mention is on page 24, we talk about 94722. The body adopted this statute just last year. It's the investment in state funds. It's proxy voting requirements related to ESG policies. And stated simply, it requires us to base our investments decisions and proxy voting only on the best financial interests of beneficiaries and pecuniary factors, not environmental, social, governmental, political, or ideological factors. And now we have then spread that same language as in reference to this statute throughout the investment statute. So it's required of our managers and all the entities, et cetera, and including the WRS, et cetera. So all entities are subject to that. So that's a pretty darn broad overview of what's a lot of complex law. But are there any questions that I can answer?
Questions for Mr. Shah? Mr. Shah, just generally speaking, based on the statutes that you highlighted, how many of those were enacted in the last 15 years?
I haven't looked, but I would say that most of them, and I would say all of them have been amended substantially in the last 15 years.
Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Could you tell us what the last time we adjusted the spending policy of any of the different spending policies in the statute would have been?
Madam Chairman, Representative Bear, I don't know the date, but I believe it was 5 years ago that some of the policies were changed. I believe, Brian, do you remember? I believe we had spending policies that were higher than 5%, and we reduced those. We had a procedure where we were going to step down the spending policies to 4.5, and we repealed that language to leave them at where they are now. I'm sorry, and I can give you exact dates if you'd like.
Madam Chair, in 2021, there was a statute, a law that was passed that did repeal the step down that was planned for I believe it was all the funds, and it was from 5% stepping down to 4.75% and then 4.5%. And so that was repealed, and they've remained at 5%.
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think just a quick statement. I think that had to do with the financial situation of the state during the COVID pandemic. So that kind of brought it all together for the repeal.
Representative Nicholas, Treasurer Meyer, please come forward, or Treasurer Meyer, if you could come forward. And Representative Nicholas, Senator Driscoll, Senator Garou, those of you who were on this committee in 2020, 2021, can you speak to that history as to why that was repealed? Anyone? You were in the legislature on appropriations program.
2021, but not on the committee. Prior to that, it was. So which section was that? So I can.
So Representative Bear intimated that we repealed the statutory reduction of the spending policy as a result of COVID. Do you recall why we passed that legislation in 2021?
Well, I know that the investment earnings were substantially higher in those time periods as a result of the extreme amount of federal spending. And so there's probably, at that point in time, thought the capacity to go to a higher spending level would be appropriate. So that's what I would say. It was probably a result of two, the need for money and availability of it for the current market.
Any comments from the historical members on this committee who were part of that?
I think also that's when we were doing the reserves.
We were doing the reserves.
And so we're putting the reserves in.
It's the
and
reserves.
we were moving into total return, which was going to give us also greater income. But as you look at privates, a lot of times you have a J curve and you don't get the total return coming in as fast in a few years because you'll buy an asset that takes time to actually develop the over revenue. Yeah.
Representative Nicholas?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It brings back old memories. But I can tell you this, it was really a battle between the House and the Senate at the time. And
Nothing to do with COVID?
And in 19 and 20, the Senate side prevailed with the reduced portions on the spending policy. And we reversed course because it wasn't really COVID so much, but it was our economic structure and the funds available and how to best use it, but also to make sure we had sufficient funds available to meet our ongoing obligations. So, and I think our good friend Patrick probably has a good recollection of that as well.
Mr. Fleming, could you come forward? It's good to see you.
Well stated.
Mr. Fleming, you've heard the questions and the commentary as to why we made the statutory changes. Do you have any insight into our historical actions and why we did what we did?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, Patrick Fleming, CIO for Treasurer's Office. As Representative just mentioned, Representative Nicholas just mentioned, there was quite the fight because at the time, then Treasurer Gordon was the one who proposed the step down. So that was put forth by Treasurer Gordon at the time. And then later that was repealed because there was a perceived interest of the ability of how much money was needed to spend for expenses at that time. And at that time, I don't remember, who was the one that prevailed, but I know that there was a fight between different factions on whether we have that money to spend or not.
The legacy continues. Thank you, Mr. Fleming. Representative Baer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Since we have all this historical knowledge here in the room, it was mentioned that the policy was higher at one point than the 5%, and my recollection was maybe 8%, but could somebody answer that question? What was it before?
Madam Chair?
Yeah, Polly?
Yes, the spending policies for the PMTF and the CSPLF were first established in 2002. The spending policy for the PMTF was 8% and 8.2% for the common school. And then they decreased the next year, and I think this was planned, to 7.625% in the PMTF and 7.83% in the common school. And then from that point on, it has been 5%.
All right, thank you. All right, we are on the topic of statutory updates from LSO staff. Any questions for Mr. Shaw based on his statutory presentation? Mr. Fuller?
Yep, Madam Chairman, to answer your question, $80 in 1968 regarding the balance of the general fund. There were statutory efforts from 1968 to 1974 to establish a permanent mineral trust fund. Those culminated in 1974 with the adoption by the people of the constitutional amendment of Article 15, Section 19, that established the constitutional fund. There's been one amendment to that section in 2006 to provide that the fund and any funds deposited in it from whatever source shall remain inviolate.
So for those of you that didn't quite clock that information, which I think is shocking to me when legislators can't answer the question, or those serving in this Capitol can't answer that question, that's so recent. The state of Wyoming had only, how much money in the checking account? $80. $80. $80. Can you imagine being elected to serve with $80 in the checkbook? And constitutionally being required to fund education? So we are in a very good position today, a remarkable work by the public servants of Wyoming who had the courage to pass that legislation, which Governor Hathaway was the governor at the time who actually campaigned against a mineral tax. The Democrat opponent was the one who proposed it as a critical idea to fund the state of Wyoming. He lost. Hathaway went back on his promise to not do it, recognizing we had how much money in the checkbook? $80, and critical changes needed to be made. And so he understood that he needed to work with the legislature to implement the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund, or the severance tax that we now receive so much of our earnings from to operate state government. And that happened within many of your lifetimes. And so for us to be able to have the luxury of serving at a time when we have such tremendous wealth as a result of fiscal stewardship, I think that's something for us to be very proud of, and no doubt as a result of many of the contributions of the people in this room today. So with that, we will take our 15-minute break to 10:05. So we'll come back after break at 10:05. Representative Pendergraph has a question.
Thank you, and I want to keep you from your coffee. I want to go back, if I may, to Mrs. Scott's numbers. 8% spending, 8.2%, so 8.2% of a piece of a pie. And then that was lowered to 6.25, and I think I heard 8.3, and then to 5. Would it be possible for you to give us the size of the pie at each point?
Madam Chair?
Yeah, Ms. Scott, is that 25 years ago when that was the case?
Yes, this was in 2002. And of course, our pie, when we talk about spending policies, is the 5-year rolling average market value. And so that's the number I'll give, and that's not the, it's going to be lower than what the market value was in most cases. So it was 1.55 billion for the PMTF in the first year, that rolling market average, and for the common school, 843.5 million. And just to give you an idea, for the end of fiscal year '24, our 5-year average for the PMTF was 8.9 billion and 4.4 billion for the common school.
All right, we will come back from break at 10:05. I do need a bigger gavel. All right, we are calling the meeting back to order. The time is 10:05. Legislators, please take your seats. All right. Good morning, Ms. Scott. Thank you for being here. We are on our number 3 agenda item for the day, additional committee education, Wyoming's investment structure. And we will turn it over to Ms. Scott.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Polly Scott, LSO Budget Fiscal Division. You have in your packet a short 3-page memo. It's item 3-01 in your electronic packet. And your chairman asked for a short primer for the committee to have about some of the key concepts that the CapFin committee deals with. So that's what this is, and it's called a fact sheet, so you know what we're talking about. So it's very brief. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but just a convenient starting place for learning about the concepts that this committee frequently deals with. It's got 5 subsections or categories covered in it. The first one is permanent funds versus non-permanent funds, and this is for purposes of spending. So the distinction between permanent funds and non-permanent funds is that permanent funds must be kept inviolate, or that means that the fund corpus, which includes the deposits made to the fund, cannot be withdrawn or spent. And this is also frequently called the cost basis. Non-permanent funds in terms of spending do not have that restriction. Funds can be made permanent in statute, but that can be revised at any time. So that does change from time to time, and there are 14 funds that are statutorily made permanent as of July 1, and those funds are listed in footnote 4. But the funds that are made permanent by the Wyoming Constitution or the Act of Admissions, that's what this committee mostly focuses on. And there are 7 of those, and they're listed on the first page. It's the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund, the PWMTF, we call it, the Hathaway Student Scholarship Endowment Fund, the Excellence in Higher Education Endowment Fund, Wyoming's Tomorrow Endowment Fund, and then 3 accounts within the Permanent Land Fund, which the Permanent Land Fund has 12 accounts, but 3 of them are inviolate for purposes of spending. It's the Common School Permanent Land Fund, CSPLF we call it, the Agricultural College account, and the University account. And again, for these funds, the corpus or the cost basis, the original deposits to the fund cannot be withdrawn or spent. Then, moving on, just the definitions of the corpus and the market value. As we've already discussed, the corpus is the original value of the deposits to the fund, also called the cost basis. And the market value is the price at which the invested assets could be sold in the market. And the difference between those is your unrealized capital gain. And your monthly portfolio update, I'm just holding up an example, that the Treasurer's Office publishes every month, always gives us both. Then moving on to Section 3 in this fact sheet, it goes over the terms interest, income, and earnings. And interest is commonly understood to be the return for lending money, usually associated with fixed income investments. Income is a broader term. It includes interest, but also dividends and any realized capital gains. Then earnings is a term that Wyoming has incorporated into statute. And a few years back, Wyoming incorporated the term earnings into its statutes. And it could be considered the broadest term, and it could be further specified in statute as to that definition. The Wyoming Constitution and the Act of Admission still use the terms interest and income with regard to what can be expended from these funds. And so at times we refer to this as our income-only spending restriction. And you'll hear more about that as we go further on in the agenda today. Just to go back to income, income can be expressed in dollars. It can also be expressed as a percent of your market value, and that's what we call yield. And it's different from return, which is also expressed as a percent of your market value, but your return is the total change in the investment value, and it includes those unrealized capital gains. And so when you hear a performance report that's presented, say by our CIOs, Ms. Sudi or CIO Fleming, they're usually focusing on return because they are conveying to you the total change in the value of that investment. But with spending policies, because we're focusing on what we can spend, and our spending is restricted to interest and income, we're talking about the yield. And so that is one thing I think is always helpful to keep in mind as you're on this committee. For spending policies, we're talking about the yield. For performance reporting, they're talking about return. They're both correct. They're just measuring different things. Okay, and feel free to ask questions at any time, of course. Then moving on to section 4 of the paper, spending policies and reserve accounts. Most funds do not have spending policies. There's many, many funds out there. You can look in your LSO data book, and there are many, many funds, and most of them do not have spending policies. Just a few of them do. The legislature established spending policies for the PWMTF and the CSPLF, as we said, in 2002, and then later on for the Hathaway and the Excellence in Higher Ed, and then most recently for Wyoming's Tomorrow and a couple of other funds. Having a spending policy supports a consistent amount of spending year to year, and having that for the PMTF, which supports spending from the general fund, and the CSPLF, which supports spending from the school foundation program, keeping that more stable aligns with budgeting and providing for those expenses of government. As we already discussed, the percentage has most commonly been set at 5% of the 5-year average market value. And using that 5-year average market value also results in more stable amount being available for spending from year to year. Wyoming's spending policies have included the use of reserve accounts for each of the permanent funds. Each of these funds has its own reserve account. And the reserve account makes up the shortfall when the investment yield is below the spending policy percentage or receives the excess, if there's more, up to a statutory maximum. And this is just kind of a broad overview of the spending policies and how they work with budgeting. And this committee every year is tasked with providing a spending policy report to the full legislature before the session convenes. And that is a very good resource to go in and look at to get more detail about each one of these accounts that has spending policies. Then moving on to section 5 of the report, which is Wyoming's investment model and the total return model.
Ms. Scott, I'm just going to stop you right there. I know I had some members of the committee ask me on break if we could at our next meeting, and I'll just signal this out to staff as well, and that we will go over our reserve accounts, kind of a primer over those as well and how they operate and the historical earnings from those. So we'll just put that on our agenda item already, and I'll let the committee know that that will be on our to-do for our next meeting. So thank you, Ms. Scott. Please continue.
Yes, certainly, Madam Chairman. We can address that. And I can tell you that the committee in past years has worked to increase the reserve accounts with the guidance of the State Treasurer's Office. They recommended that those reserve accounts get into a kind of a range of 5 times to 7 times the annual spending policy amount so that they could be invested more for growth. And that three of those accounts, the PMTF, the Common School, and the Hathaway, are on track to be at that 5 times the spending policy amount. For fiscal year '25, the excellence in higher ed is a little short of the 5 times. None of them are yet at the 7 times amount, but that is the statutory maximum that we have at this point in time. Yes. And we can go into more about that at the next meeting. So now, moving into Section 5, Wyoming's investment model and the total return model. This is a brief comparison just to highlight that Wyoming's way of investing has been influenced by the income-only restrictions on spending. And that generally, although this has been changing, there has been a need to focus on income-producing investments. And total return investing is a strategy that focuses on the overall return of the portfolio, and it includes the income and the unrealized capital gains. And in general, our CIO and our state treasurer, as well as our state consultant, our VK, have conveyed to us that, that the total return investing performance has been better in the past, looking backward, than Wyoming's style with that income focus. And that is exactly why the committee has worked to remove the income-only spending restrictions and also worked to enhance the reserve accounts. And I know that this is actually, next on your agenda to talk about and review the work that the committee has done on changing the income-only spending restrictions. So that is my summary, Madam Chairman.
All right, thank you, Ms. Scott. Any questions from the committee? Any points you want to highlight? All right, seeing none, Ms. Scott, thank you. All right, with that, we are moving on to agenda item number 4, very much on time and under budget. And we will start with 2025 legislation of House Joint Resolution 1, amending Wyoming's active admission for earnings. Mr. Shaw, welcome back.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. So in this part of the agenda, we'll provide some background on the legislation that was passed last year and in prior years that deal with the topics that we're discussing now and that you've kind of received education on this morning. It was a fairly active year in that regard because there were some fairly important pieces of legislation that, will probably take the majority of our morning and potentially into the afternoon. The first of those was House Joint Resolution 1 passed last year. And Polly just described that we have an income-only limitation on our spending. And that is to say, in the active admission, which is specifically at issue here, it talks about spending interest or income for the support of public schools. What it doesn't talk about is spending earnings for the support of public schools. And because the terms interest and income we've interpreted to be more narrow than the term earnings, it means that we're limited in the amount we can spend to only interest or income, which means that our investment folks have to produce interest or income at the potential exclusion of producing earnings. And that limits the kind of investment strategies they have. And so this is specific to the active admission. Language in the active admission in 3 places uses those terms interest and income. The resolution that was passed last year asked Congress to go in and I think fairly simply change those, in those 3 instances, the terms references to income or interest to the terms earnings. So we had a discussion with our congressional delegation. I think we're kind of lucky we got them all together in April, all the representatives on one Zoom call. Quite a few legislators participated in that call, members of the Treasurer's Office. It was a pretty good meeting of a lot of different minds. And we presented to them what this legislation is about and what it asks them to do. They didn't have a lot of background on the active admission because needless to say, it's an old piece of legislation that they haven't considered in a while. But we pointed out the fact that other states have already amended their acts of admission otherwise to accomplish this same type of purpose. It's not exactly like ours, but it's equivalent because that's what they were looking to do is get to a broader ability to invest their monies. And on May 1st, then, we sent a formal letter to them at their request that is a formal request that they adopt legislation to amend our Act of Admission. Just as recently as last week, I did talk to representatives from their office. The members themselves are still considering that letter and are trying to better understand what it asks for. It was tempting to write them a big, long letter that went into a lot of detail. But the fact is this problem is relatively simple. I mean, its implications are large because it really does allow our investment folks to have more authority and more ability to adopt more advantageous investment strategies. But what we need from Congress, and the reason we need it, is pretty darn simple. And so the letter that you have in your packet dated May 1st is a copy of that letter that was sent to the congressional delegations. They're currently working on it. I offered this week to, if they wanted me to update the committee any further on what their procedures are, and they just reaffirmed that they are considering it, that their members are actually looking at it now, because this was just staff members we were talking to in their offices earlier. So it's in progress, I guess. I anticipate, they had indicated to me when I first sent the letter that it would be a, quote, couple of weeks. And it's been more than that now, but I think that they're taking an active interest in it, and I don't have any reason at this point to think that they'll delay their consideration of it. But I will also guarantee the committee I'll keep on them, just keep asking them to update us on the status of that. Obviously, rather than running a standalone bill for this kind of thing, I would anticipate that it would be attached to some other bill that's before Congress and be passed that way. And some of the examples that we looked at before, it was done that way as well.
Madam Chair.
Representative Nicholas?
So I think it's always useful for me particularly to have our Chief Investment Officer, Patrick, describe in detail why we're doing this, because he has the way of articulating it that is unique and easy to understand. So it would be all right. I think it'd be useful for him to come up and walk us through that.
Yeah, Mr. Fleming, can you come forward, please? Interest, income, and earnings. Mr. Fleming, please advise.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as Mr. Shaw alluded to, historically, the need for income has caused the portfolio to have a higher focus on interest income-bearing securities. So if you look at it, interest income, dividends, and realized capital gains is what we spend. So if you look at it, obviously we have no idea what the realized capital gains are. I have never once purposely realized a capital gain to be able to spend for our spending policies. So with that, when you look at it in bonds historically, are lower returning securities than equities. So of course, if you have more bonds, you're going to have a lower return. So what we're talking about doing here in principle is saying, well, first of all, other states have done this, but if we can move the fund to have the ability to invest like an endowment. So what does that mean? Let's say the Ivy League schools, or pick any major institution, endowment institution. So what they're able to do is they don't care what the source is of the income. They just look at the spending policy and whatever it is, and they spend it. So for us, if we're looking at it and saying, well, if we could do the same thing, then we would be able to free up a lot of these investments that are in lower yielding securities and take advantage of what's called the illiquidity ratio, because securities that you can sell immediately versus securities that you have to hold for 3, 5, 7, 10 years typically have about a 3% return differential. So what would that mean in dollars for the fund? Let's just put dollars and cents. So if you're saying 10-year PMTF return, 6.3%, the average endowment is over the last 10 years was between 8 and 10%. So let's just use 300 basis points. So 3% times the permanent funds, which are like, $18 billion or what have you, we're significant amount of money we're leaving on the table. So to be able to change this, we would then need to do some constitutional amendments, which first off, as Mr. Shaw alluded to, is the Act of Admissions from 1890. It's a heavy lift, but other states have done this. And all kinds of people throughout the world do this. New Zealand Superannuation Fund, Australia Superannuation. This is not new. We have all kinds of data to show how it is a much better way to invest than the way that we're doing now. But then the next step is we would have to have a constitutional amendment, a state constitutional amendment, to allow us to do that, to free up our ability to just look at the total return. So just circling back, just simplistic. Let's say you have $100 and you invested in NVIDIA. And the next year, that value of NVIDIA is $200. And you go, hey, I just made 100% return on my money. Let's go have dinner. The way our spending policy is no, you can only get the dividend that NVIDIA pays. So if they don't pay a dividend, we can't spend it. So here you know the return of the fund is 100%, and yet we can't spend it because of our policies. And that's the biggest problem that we have. If we did this, you don't need a reserve account. You don't need all of these other things that you would need. It would just allow us to really take the next step that would free up a significant amount of earnings potential that our permanent funds would have, which would be approximately $20 billion.
Mr. Fleming, excellent. Any questions for Mr. Fleming, who put a very fine point on what we're doing? All right, seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, anything final, Mr. Shaw, on House Joint Resolution 1?
Madam Chairman, no, other than as Mr. Fleming mentioned, there will be necessary. The first procedure with regard to the act of admission is to get the act of admission amended. Of course, after the act of admission is amended to allow us to spend earnings, we still have to then amend our Constitution, because right now the Constitution reflects what the act of admission says. So it is a multi-step process to get this done, and likely a multi-year process to get it done.
Representative Baer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just to make it clear, this multi-step process has to be done in order as well. You can't change the Wyoming Constitution prior to seeing the change in the act of admission. In other words, you couldn't do a trigger change. Is that accurate?
Madam Chairman, Representative Baer, and was that last thing you said, you couldn't do a trigger change? Madam Chairman, yes, you likely could if you wanted to do a trigger change. The problem with that, though, is just that it has to go before the people. And a trigger change, a constitutional amendment that you put before the people, you'd have to consider whether you'd want to put it before the people with a statement that said, but we're not sure, or that Congress has to act first. But I mean, I don't think legally there's anything that would prohibit from being active until Congress acts. But otherwise, yes, Congress does. We're bound. We accepted the lands in the act of admission contingent upon us accepting those terms where we only use interest and income for the purpose of public schools. So that does have to change before we could effectively change our Constitution and treat it otherwise.
All right. Seeing nothing further on that, we will go to 2025 legislation, Senate File 70, Investment Modernization State Non-Permanent Funds.
Madam Chairman, I'm going to handle that one as well. Karen, can you bring up that flow chart? You have in your materials, or have been provided to you, a flow chart, and the top it does say 25 LSO 153. I'm sorry, it says 25 Senate File 70. This used to be 25 LSO 153. This is a bill that was considered by, yes, that's the one. And this is a bill draft that was considered by several years by the committee, partially in our effort to try to modernize our spending practices. This was easier because these are two funds, the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Fund and the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, that are statutorily created. And so we don't have to amend any constitution or otherwise deal with any constitutional limitations. Instead, this was the legislature decided that these were priorities and put significant funds into these two type of grant programs and used a corpus and a trust fund to do that. And in statute, we declared that those trust funds would be inviolate, which means that we won't use money from the trust fund to fund these programs. Instead, we'll allow them to be invested, and then we'll use the investment earnings to fund the programs. Previously then, the trust funds were inviolate in both of these programs, and we used the earnings which fluctuated from year to year. That meant that the programs themselves, some years would have X a number of dollars and the next year would have plus or minus that amount to spend, and there was not an even amount of spending each year. Now, the programs, I think, did a good job of regulating on their own and not overspending, but the fact is, it also didn't provide for earnings to be tipped back into those trust funds themselves. That would be for the purpose of things like inflation proofing those trust funds. The legislature did decide on its own to put more money into those funds to make the programs more successful, provide more funding, or to inflation proof, but there was no natural mechanism to have that happen. No money automatically from excess earnings going back to those trust funds. So last year, Senate File 70 was introduced and passed by the legislature. And, the bill is large and it does a lot of different things, but ultimately it follows what we have up here on this chart, where we simply provide a trust fund that is no longer inviolate. And that sounds kind of scary, but what the statute equally does is say, okay, it's not technically inviolate, but the only things you can take out of it are the spending policy amount. And that's represented by the line at the top of this graph that says, every year, either 4% in the Wyoming Wildlife Trust or 3% if you're talking about the Cultural Trust Fund, will be taken from the trust fund and transferred over to the income account. And the income account then will use that money to fund grants. It's a very simple procedure, and it provides a standard amount of spending each year for those two programs, either 4% of the 5-year average of the fund's value or 3%. And the reason those numbers are different is that the committee consulted with the Treasurer's Office, and the Cultural Trust Fund is a substantially smaller fund, and consequently there aren't some of those advantages of scale where they'll get the same earnings or expected earnings from year to year. So to make it safe and to provide some money, every time we earn more than the spending policy, that amount is tipped back into the trust fund, allowing the trust fund to get better, allowing it to handle fluctuations in market and inflation proof it. And so in both of these accounts, both of them can be invested in stocks and equities, but all the investment earnings, no matter what, they won't go back to the income account if they're earned by the income account. Instead, all earnings are put back in the trust fund, which then again just helps every year a standard amount, either 3 or 4%, is transferred over to the income account. There are some differences here. We didn't try to change these accounts or some of their structure. Instead, we just tried to implement this new system, which means that right now, someone can gift amounts to these programs, or the legislature can specifically appropriate amounts for these programs for specific projects, for example. We maintain that structure in this bill. So there are some differences when you look at the actual statutory language. For example, the income account isn't only the spending a policy amount that's transferred every year. That's the only thing that can come from the trust fund, but we could gift excess amounts to that. We could receive donations or bequests that would go to that fund, et cetera. So there are some other amounts that are in that income fund, but fundamentally, the only thing you can ever get from the trust fund is a standard spending policy amount every year. And that's meant to inflation-proof the trust fund because it does get those excess earnings above the spending policy, and it allows the organizations that operate these grant programs to have a standard amount of grant funding every year. So I believe that we've invited, I don't know if they're here, but if it's awfully early. I mean, those programs haven't had much of a chance to implement this program, and certainly the Treasurer's Office is catching up with how that's going to operate from an investment standpoint. So I don't know if we have other testimony, but my purpose was just to let you understand how the program works.
We do have other testimony here that's joined us this morning. So all of those who intend on testifying on the implementation on Senate File 70, if you'd like to just come forward. All right, looks like we have the Treasurer's Office team here. Good to see you. If you could introduce yourself to the committee and provide your comments.
Good morning, members of the committee and Madam Chair. My name is Seth Consolver, and I work on the investment team at the Treasurer's Office. Mr. Shaw kind of already explained what Senate File 70 does. Changes Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust Fund and the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund. And the biggest change he kind of went through already is those changes in the spending policies and the change from inviolate to spendable corpuses. So as far as our activities go inside of the Treasurer's Office to prepare for these changes, the income accounts to facilitate the new spending policies are already open and operational. So functionally, not a whole lot will change there other than just making new spending calculations and also calculations for the one-year carry forwards whenever those are applicable. So our accounting team is well aware of those conversions and understands that what those entail. And I've been told that the process is well underway to make those effective next fiscal year. The other key provision of Senate File 70 is the movement of the funds from Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust and the Cultural Fund. The movement of those funds from Pool A to one of our other pools with an endowment-like allocation model. And in this case as well, our accounting team is currently studying what the best approach would be. There are a couple methods that they've already identified, one that would involve selling down some of the assets and then rebuying, and another one that would entail just moving the PSA. One of those is definitely better than the others. We're just kind of studying which is more feasible. Importantly, the mandate for that transition is understood, and in the beginning of the next fiscal year, a decision will have been made in terms of the methodology to use, and the process to begin implementation of the asset movement will be underway. So that's my brief summary. Thank you for your chance to, I guess, review that. I'll yield the floor back to you, Madam Chair.
Any questions, committee? Seeing none, great job. Any additional comments?
Madam Chair, Sarah Sheen, I am the Deputy Director of State Parks Cultural Resources. Just wanted to say quickly that we are ready to roll on, figuring out how to make this work moving forward, figuring out the 3%. Essentially, we are asking for spending authority as much as we possibly can so that we can cover the bases and make sure that we have enough spending authority for whatever the 3% ends up being. The statute stipulates pretty clearly how that average will be determined. So obviously, it's going to be a little more tricky to determine what that 3% is until there is an average amount over the next couple of years. But we are, ready to follow the statute, and things are going as planned, I think.
And when you say cover the bases, what does that mean exactly?
Just making sure that we have enough spending authority for whatever the amount of the 3% ends up being.
Senator Guru.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, if I could go back for just 1 second to Seth for just a minute. What's your time frame as you're going through this to come up with a decision on what the best course is from the Treasurer's Office perspective?
Yeah, so our CFO, Katie Smith, would have more clarification on that, but I believe in July is when they'll start, I guess, more seriously approaching which method. Again, there's two methods to make this happen. One of them is way more cost efficient. We're just not entirely sure whether we can do it, so I think she's got to make some discussions with auditors, make sure that way can happen. If that can happen, that'd be quick. That'd be within a matter of a month, potentially. The other way would take a bit more time, and I'm not sure how much time, but you would have to sell down some assets and then repurchase, so.
Madam Chair, follow-up?
Mr. Fleming?
Just so the committee is fully aware how this works, we have the data. So as you know from the bill, you'll look back in this rolling average at how that works. So we know what the returns were for the previous years. So we have all those price points. The one that we don't have is the June 30 number. Okay, so how it works is on June 30th, finalize, get the books, the managers send us their return numbers, they verify it and so forth. For the non-alternative assets, just like stocks and bonds, that's really easy. We'll know that within 2 months. But for the alternatives, it takes longer. So from our books of records, Katie Smith will not have a final number until sometime in October. And that's just how the alternatives work. They're delayed by 3 months, typically is the normal course of action. So the difference on this is that Pool A, as Seth was mentioning before, that we're transferring the funds to, have very small percentage in alternatives. So we're going to be, we know 4 years number, all we need is that one number. So when you're taking the average of a 5-year number, when we're actually at that point, this amount is going to be de minimis. So once we get the books for our main assets, the equities and the bonds or so forth, we're going to have a very, very close average that, both entities will be very knowledgeable about what approximately that number is.
Thank you, Mr. Fleming. Senator Crum.
Madam Chairman, my question is more educational, is talk about alternative investments. What type of alternative investments does the state have? Just a sample of what we may have.
So right now, Madam Chair, Senator Crum, right now, the alternatives, so for all of you that are not familiar with our nomenclature, so I apologize for not being clear on that. So alternatives are basically any asset that we've purchased that really uses leverage. That's kind of our definition of an alternative. An alternative is usually much less liquid. It can be anywhere from 1 to 2 years to up to 13 to 15 years in the case of private equity. So if you looked at the whole gamut of some of the alternatives that we'd have, that would be private equity, private credit, real estate, hedge funds, those types of assets that we would call an alternative.
Representative Nicholas.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. A couple different questions. First of all, how much are in each of these funds? Just remind us if you would. And then I might just kind of lay these out so as you answer, or we can respond to them as we go. Why the 4% and why the 3%? How do we derive those numbers? And then on the big picture, what's the risk of doing this? So in other words, when we're on the floor of the House and we're trying to explain this bill, and how do we answer the questions properly in terms of how does this change the risk by going from inviolate to non-inviolate, so that we're not, because the word itself just seems to be, the suggestion is that it's more susceptible to being spending more than or above that percentage. So how would you address those questions on the floor of the House when you're not an expert like you?
Madam Chair, Representative Nicholas, I'll start off on the spending policy. Those numbers were actually derived from the two entities, and they looked historically at the spending needs that they had. And those numbers were actually from the entities themselves and their historical ability to generate that number. So that was the one part. Part two of your question, this gets back to what I was up here testifying before about this quasi-endowment model that we're working on. So this was, for many of you that were in this committee before, this was kind of the test case of what we could do. So when you're looking at it, and I was really kind of simplifying the version of really what needs to be done on this, because there's a lot of different things. My suggestion is you still need the inviolate nature. Even if we do this full endowment model and pass it, you would still need inviolate nature. You don't want to be spending down the money, because otherwise we have $3 billion in gains, unrealized gains. If there wasn't that spending, you could just, boom, future legislation could just go in and spend $3 billion. So you don't want to do that. So to protect it, so having a spending policy, having the inviolate nature, what happens if the corpus drops below market cost? There's a lot of different things in this, but it's not new. Treasurer was talking about, Utah, New Mexico, Idaho, various states have done this. It's not rocket science. So getting back to your point, what is the risk? So the risk is that you come down and you have $100 in your account. And let's say $10 is in unrealized gains or what have you, and you're spending your $3. Okay, so market drops significantly and that value comes down. So if you're in violet without the spending policies that the PMTF and so forth would have, they would still be able to spend that money regardless of the value of the fund. Where the PMTF, if you have it in violet and things like that, then boom, no, you would go back, you would revert back to interest income, dividends, and realized capital gains only. So that's the difference between the two. But to answer your question, that is the risk. But you need the money. And assuming that you believe that capital markets have a tendency to appreciate, and 7% or whatever number you want to use is a realistic number, that over time, it's not going to be an issue if you have that amount of money. Also, they also kept some of the, I know in Wyoming Wildlife Natural Resource Trust, they kept some of the reserve accounts that they had in there. So that's still in there to give them a little cushion. And I don't know about the Cultural Trust Fund if you have a reserve account as well. But those are funds that they still would be able to use to kind of buffer some of those highs and lows, which we all know markets go up and they go down. But that would be an issue then where you actually are spending corpus. If we had a serious equity correction and you were still spending that 3%.
Madam Chair, and I'll answer Representative Nicholas's question about the size, I think. So currently there's, in the Wildlife Fund, there's $202 million in corpus, and about $100 million in the income fund. That's in corpus, so the actual market value's above that by, I imagine, a substantial margin. And then the Cultural Fund has $28 million in corpus and $1.5 million in the income.
So at 3% or 4% over a 10-year period, it's going to be, the returns should be well above a 3 or 4% on the endowment model that we're creating, which means that by only spending that much, these funds should continue to grow over time by themselves. Is that kind of part of the plan?
Madam Chair, Representative, that's exactly the case.
Self-sustaining, is that the word you're seeking, Representative Nicholas? All right, thank you. Any additional comments or questions on Senate File 70? Director Budd.
Morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Bob Budd, I'm the Director of the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust. Very briefly, I just want to let people know we've spent probably 3 years now, I think, working on this model with the Treasurer's Office, with this committee, with the legislature in general, and with my board, express our support for it. We think it is a very reasonable way to approach it. We've gone through highs and lows in the last 20 years. We've had to cut back on what we could allocate. We've had to make those adjustments. This does what we've been doing, but it does it in a manner that is much more responsible. We think it has a higher ceiling as far as earnings and our potential to grow the fund and inflation-proof it. So just mainly here to express our support. We don't think it will interrupt the way we do things. I would say the next probably 2 to 3 years as we develop some of those benchmarks and those baselines, we're going to have to be very mindful of what we're doing. But as Mr. Fleming pointed out, we have managed to maintain that income account as a reserve account to let us do this and not disrupt it. The last thing I would point out is that the numbers, the 202 million ballpark is what we have in the corpus. The 100 million that is in the income account sounds astounding, but just remind you that 49.5 of that was put in this year to deal with fire. And there's money in there for other purposes specifically from the legislature. So it's not a situation where we're hoarding money or trying to hold it back. I would also point out that in the past, the way we tried to achieve what's being done in this legislation was that we asked for authority through the Select Committee and the legislature for the board to recommend allocating funds when we had years where we had excessive earnings for over what we were doing, and allow the board to recommend that being put into the corpus. That's been done twice. So the board has actually committed funds to the corpus where we had earnings that were greater than that 4%, which has always been our budget number. So this is basically codifies what we've tried to do in practice over the last 20 years. So appreciate the opportunity to comment, Madam Chair.
Director Budd, thank you. For those that don't know maybe what all the Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust does or funds, can you provide additional, just general big picture idea of the expenditures that are used by the fund for Wyoming? You mentioned the fire monies that you received, about 49 million,
Right.
I think, for fire monies. But what additional projects do you fund across the state?
Madam Chair, I think you could break down what we do into the regular earnings that we use fund the projects that come in. We just had our board meeting Tuesday and funded $5.5 million in projects. The impact of that on the ground will be $33 million when we look at the matching funds we get. Those are everything from river restoration projects to fire prevention, removal of conifers, wetland development, rangeland projects, healthy forest initiative, and that. Over the years, we have been directed by the legislature to deal with bark beetles in the northeast part of the state and in Uintah County. We have dealt with mitigation funds for Rocky Mountain Power that the BLM couldn't do, so we did that for them. We're managing those funds right now. We've had fire money. We've had invasive grass money. Those are all, and highway crossings and migration. Those are the primary ones that have been other duties as assigned. I think that's the job description. And we just take those, they are all in segregated funds, so where they're not mixed and we know exactly which one of those. So when the legislature tells us, we want you to deal with migrations, those come out of that funding from the legislature specifically. The board also has allocated their regular funds to supplement that at times. But it's a very broad portfolio, 1,500 projects in the last 20 years. We've looked at over 2,000 projects, and it runs the gamut of natural resource projects, other than the four things we're not allowed to do, which is buy land, buy water, introduce endangered species, and require public access.
What are the big projects on your radar that you're concerned about not having enough funds for?
Madam Chair, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Are there any projects that the board is examining that they're concerned there won't be enough funds for?
Madam Chair, that's a bit of a loaded question because we get so much leverage that with some of the freeze on the BIL money that came out of the feds, other programs that are being analyzed at the federal level, as an example, EQIP under the Natural Resource Conservation Service is a major funder of a lot of these projects, particularly with private landowners. Those are a little bit in limbo. Some of them are getting released. As an example, they froze all of the fish passage money 3-4 months ago. That's now starting to be released. So there are concerns, but there aren't concerns with what we're doing and the revenue that we're generating, other than the fact that demand is always greater than what supply is. And that's not a bad thing. If you have enough to fund everything you're asked for, you're going to fund some duds. This process is very, very iterative. I mean, it's very intense. And when we get out in the field and look at projects, the board has denied 2 immediately this year. And then when we got out on the ground, there were another 5 that weren't ready. And they said, come back when you're ready. So we're not concerned about that, no.
Senator Guru.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, kind of going back around, and I wanted to follow up, and we kind of got away, and then Bob brought me back, so I appreciate it. The reason why I was asking the question of the Treasurer's Office, and I want you to know clearly, and everyone to know, I wasn't asking like a gotcha question as far as when we're going to get this done. What I was alluding to was getting a number is important. Getting to a number is important for these folks because due to changing priorities at the federal level and how funds are being distributed to each group, knowing what the number is going forward from this fund is going to probably determine what their ask is going to be in the budget and whether it's fundraising or anything else. So knowing that sooner rather than later is going to be important to them as they try to chart their futures, especially as I look over Bob's shoulder to Sarah back there and her, especially in her side of the shop, because their funding has been altered. And so it's going to be even more pressure on her. And Dave and Herb folks to try to figure that out so they can get numbers for when we get to appropriations to have those numbers. And so that's why I think it's key. And to get to that number as soon as possible to help them out and formulate their ask. So that was just a comment on that. I'd say, wouldn't you agree, Bob?
Madam Chair.
Director?
Senator Grew, I would agree that getting that number as soon as possible is advantageous, but we are going to budget based on the money we have. We are not going to budget on an accrual system where we think we might earn something. So October of 2025, that's the number we will use for 2026-7. So, and that's what we've done in the past. You're looking forward and you're looking back. As far as our operation, as I said, we've always budgeted 4%. We will continue to do that. If we come in and we're under budget, then we'll make those adjustments. We grant money twice a year, so we have the ability to make those adjustments as we move forward. So not a concern.
All right, any final questions for Director Budd? Mr. Fleming, any questions? I see online. Sure. Thank you, everyone. I see online. With that, we will go to public comment online. See we have Senator Hicks joining us. Senator Hicks, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chairman and members of the committee. I'll be brief. I think much of what was stated, but and I think as a past long-serving member of this with Representative Nicholas, this whole effort, many of these takes years. And so I think it was alluded to by Director Budd, it was 3 years to get us to this point. But I want to bring back to the committee a very important long-term aspect of this. And I think you alluded to it earlier, Chairman Nethercott. This effort was designed to do two things, was to increase investment returns and inflation-proof those accounts. And so it resulted in the change of the inviolate nature, setting pending policies and this nature. And I think going forward with the revenue challenges that we're going to face, I would encourage the committee to continue to stay focused on how do we use all of our funds to generate a higher rate of return to be able to fund government so we can keep taxes low in Wyoming. I know later today you're going to bring up a topic of gaming. I would put it in the context of looking at what we've done with the Wildlife Trust Fund and the Cultural Resource Trust Fund, and we're going to have to get out of the box. So just those 2 points. Remember, this whole effort was designed to increase investment returns for the beneficiaries, but also inflation-proof those accounts. So thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning, Madam.
Thank you, Senator Hicks. I know you worked very hard on this piece of legislation. Appreciate what you've done for the trust fund. All right. Thank you, Senator. All right. Moving on to our third item.
Three institutional managers, which we've had a relationship with, JPM, Wells Fargo, and UBS. We like to work with institutional managers as this is our first time acquiring physical precious metal, and we have a relationship with them. And each of these institutions have a history in purchasing physical gold and silver. Right now, we have just gotten preliminary numbers, and we're still in the phase of negotiation for our final gold and silver purchase. Right now, JPM is offering us the most ideal quotation and cost structure. Since we don't see too much difference in terms of the competency of any of these managers, now we're just simply looking for the lowest cost. Other than that, Brinks will be our most likely transportation of choice. Each of these managers have recommended them. They're the gold standard of this industry in terms of armored transportation, so there's not too much concern here. In terms of liability,
just a quick question here.
Yes.
So you mentioned Brinks. I think we've all seen their trucks driving around, maybe carrying cash from retail businesses to banks, that type of thing. So when we purchase this gold, $10 million of it, is that right?
Madam Chair, $10 million of gold or silver, depending on the state treasurer.
And so we're going to put that into trucks and drive them across the country, I'm assuming, is wherever we purchase them from, physically transport the gold, and then store it. Do we identify where publicly?
Madam Chair, my colleague, Mr. Spate, will be touching more on our options for storing. We have not made a final decision. In terms of transportation, gold is actually transported by aircraft, considering it is more valuable. It is the more ideal choice of transportation, and the silver will be transported by armored vehicle.
But we don't know where it will be stored. Will it be stored within the state?
Madam Chair, Andrew Spate, Investment Analyst with the State Treasurer's Office. So we've identified or narrowed down our selection process to either the Wyoming Reserve in Casper or a COMEX network vault, probably on the coast. So both offer equal storage quality. Both are capable of storing precious metals. But some of the considerations we've made for those are with the Wyoming Reserve, it's in Casper, and it offers ease of access for audits or.
Mr. Spate, who owns that company?
Madam Chair, it is Josh Fair, CEO of Wyoming Reserve.
Are there any legislators that own that company?
Madam Chair, not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, I'll continue with some of the considerations we've made. For the COMEX vaults, they are institutional and they have extensive experience in the handling of precious metals. And they have offered us lower quotes for the storage of precious metals, but it would be likely commingled with other investors' assets in New York. And they would be differentiated by serial number, but it would be more difficult to access and audit. But when it comes down to storage costs, they're subject to final negotiation of material terms, but the COMEX depositories, likely JPM, have offered us a lower quote in that regard. And with that, that concludes my update on storage.
Great job. Representative Nicholas?
So what's the cost? It seems to me we ought to have a spreadsheet of what the storage cost is, what the daily cost or monthly, yearly cost,
Is there insurance on this as well?
plus insurance, plus transportation, all of those costs.
Yeah, what is the whole total cost for us to have some gold?
Madam Chair, Representative Nicholas, because it's a public forum, we wouldn't prefer to share the quotes they receive because they will offer us oftentimes a better deal than public customers. But it is insured. It's both sources, both storage, they have insurance, and the insurance often switches when it changes hands of possession. So it'll be insured by Brinks in transport, and then it'll be insured by the reserve or the COMEX vault when it's in the vault.
Ballpark it? Like, what's the general range for the costs associated with the possession of this, with the transport and possession of the gold?
Madam Chair, so our account size for the Wyoming Reserve, they're charging us 18 basis points for storage annually. And JPM, or the COMEX depository, is charging $15 per 100 troy ounces per month. And I won't go into the annual cost of that for an exact dollar amount, but.
Madam Chair, could I just follow up on that? So this is very preliminary numbers. And so our analysts have done a great job looking at all of the alternatives. And so the process that we're moving forward with is that after we get all of the numbers together, the treasurer is going to make the decision on which way we go after all factors and all negotiations. So when you look at storage costs, what have you, what would be the other alternative? You could buy a gold ETF. GLD is a common ETF, and its expense ratio is 40 basis points. So we're looking at a lower cost than purchasing gold in the secondary market, which we could buy and sell immediately, which is advantageous. But this would be a cost-effective way as we move forward.
Representative Storer?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm curious what the timeline is for when we will be required to hold this asset, given just that the price of gold has gone up so much in the recent months, and whether we have, what kind of flexibility we have. Thanks.
Madam Chair, Representative, the treasurer has been talking with us, and we are trying to execute it within the few months. Specifically, if we're thinking a limit, definitely by this upcoming fiscal year, we should have a plan in place for purchasing, acquiring, and storing the precious metals. In terms of price appreciation, we are considering that in the sense that it's for capital preservation, so we're not making necessarily tactical decisions based off when we will purchase it. The price of gold tends to appreciate over time, and there's no real best way to try to tactically find the low of purchasing any gold or silver.
Representative Bear?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. Parnell, you were just about to talk about liability. Could you tell us who you're looking at for liability, what the cost of that liability insurance would be?
Madam Chair, Representative, the liability for Brinks is solely on them in transportation until we hand it off at any vault. So if anything is lost or stolen in transportation, that is built into the cost of what we pay them. And for the vaults, both the Wyoming Reserve and COMEX, the insurance is also built into the cost. There is an upper limit on the insurance, but we are under that. So it will basically be fully insured.
Follow-up.
Follow-up.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just could you tell us what that upper limit is, since you mentioned it?
Madam Chair, Representative, I believe it is $50 million for the vault in insurance.
And gentlemen, if you know, are there any other state governments that invest in physical asset precious metals?
Madam Chair, yes, there are. I don't have the list, but for instance, Wyoming Retirement is just one of them. They've done a great job of purchasing gold years ago at a very favorable price, but other institutions are buying them. And just a quick background of this, it's not only this information that we've done. The treasurer and the entire investments staff that was involved in this went to Casper to view the services. I spoke extensively with Kim DeVore with Jonah Bank, who said they're able to discuss that they do have a relationship with them, and talked about the investment process, the being able to actually look at what you have and making sure that they're holding the actual securities that you have. And she was extremely favorable on all of their operations. I had a very long talk with Ms. Fair going over things. So this is just the kind of the end stage, but this process of interviewing all of these different entities has been better part of 3 months, would you say? So, and this is kind of, we're down to the last 2 finalists, and it will all depend upon cost and the treasurer's decision on which way we go.
Senator Guru.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. For me, I guess the point is that once the treasurer's made the decision on which way to do this, once that's made, it would be helpful, because I don't want you to disclose any proprietary information. I don't think anyone in the committee does, but it would just be nice to know at the end of the day, what was the cost of doing this? What was the opportunity cost of making this purchase? So not only the cost of the instrument itself, but the storage, the insurance, and everything else that's associated with it. Just so then, once again, and I think maybe the good representative is going, when we're trying to justify these A to ourselves, B to the floor, what are the relative costs? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? What are the costs? So that we can just parse that out. And so that's, I think, what, at least for me, what would be most helpful at the end of the day. So we can just look at one versus the other in all our investments. So just, that's what I'd be looking for.
Madam Chair, Senator, that will be easy for us to do. And so what Andrew was referring to is these were original quotes. We haven't negotiated, we haven't done anything. But once we put everything together, when we give you the total cost of it, then no one will know, they can't parse. And so we'll be able to give you all of that. Just to clarification on your opportunity cost, this is a PPI, so where we're taking the funds out, we'd be able to show you the difference of where the funds, what they would return elsewhere. And we could do that on an annual basis if the committee show wishes with the rest of our returns. We could show you what that cost is and the opportunity cost going forward.
Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You mentioned that WRS has invested in gold. I'm assuming that's paper format, but if not, what have they chosen for storage and transportation? If you could just share with us.
We can defer to them. I see them in the room, so we'll invite them up next and let them answer that. Are there any other questions for the Treasurer's Office concerning the acquisition of these precious metals? All right, so Representative Nicholas?
So, this is probably just for you, Patrick. The number one, if you're buying bullion and you're storing it, there's a psychological and an emotional reason to do it, because it's kind of a bird in hand kind of a concept that if the world falls apart and we go into a major recession, we've got real money there. So there's a value in that. But let's say we buy $10 million in gold bullion. You don't really have the opportunity to trade it on a regular basis. It's just going to sit there. So what's the median long-term plan? I mean, other than just adding more or subtracting to and from based upon market flows, but just can you walk me through that in terms of your investment strategy?
Yes, Madam Chair, Representative Nicholas. So this is going to be up to the treasurer and I guess the next CIO to decide what they want to do with this. But in general, what the thought process right now, because the statute reads gold and silver. So one of the things that we're looking at is saying, this would be an insurance policy. Let's say something cataclysmic happens or what have you, and you can't use the banking system. Fedwire goes down, what have you, and you have this. Well, we have these gold bars, so we go get it, and what do we do? You take chip a little piece off and say, okay. So that's a decision that the treasurer's looking at. But actually, if you look at it, and there's numerous different people, myself included, is saying that if you're going to do this, you really should have silver in there as well, because you can actually take a silver bar. Silver bars would be, right now the ratio is 100 to 1 gold to silver. You could actually take a silver bar, silver coin, what have you, and spend it. It might be $3,000, $5,000 an ounce, but you could actually use this. So the thought process on this is not from the investment side, because as you all know, I testified from an investment process, gold has underperformed stocks over a 30-year period by over 150% or whatever. It's dramatic. But you can't spend a stock. You're not going to spend NVIDIA, or IBM, what have you, in times of stress. So this is really safeguarding, having a de minimis amount of the total fund in case something happens. And so in that instance, trading it is really not the thought process of initially what I was and the rest of the crew thinking.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. We'll go to the retirement system, to Mr. Masadi, to explain the retirement system's investments in precious metals.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I didn't come prepared to speak about this, but I think I remember enough of the details. So we do not own physical gold. We own an ETF that owns physical gold. And we pay about 7 basis points for that, and it's tradable. The trust, this ETF owns about $50 billion in gold. So you can imagine the scale of that in terms of storage and insurance and auditing of those amounts. And the reason we don't own physical gold is just because it's difficult to transact. If we want to reduce our gold holdings tomorrow, we get on the phone to the traders and have them liquidate versus, calling an armored car to pick it up. So I don't know all the rationale for the bill, so I can't really comment on that, but just sort of our view in terms of physical holdings, it's not something we would do. And I believe you asked a question of how many states own physical gold, and I'm not aware of any. I think UTIMCO, which is the Texas Public University Endowment, years ago, they did it, and they were doing scale of, $1 billion or something like that. I don't know if they still do it, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah, Madam Chairman, members of the committee, Dave Swindell, Director of the Retirement System. Just so you know, the board establishes the asset allocation, and they did establish gold as a separate asset class. We haven't always held gold. As Mr. Fleming alluded to, there have been periods of time where gold has not been a good performing asset. There are times where it has been. Right now, the board's policy statement for gold is the target allocation is 1.5% of the portfolio with a range of 0 to 7%. So from the board's perspective, we're not required to hold gold, but the general guidance is about 1.5%, and we're above that right now. It's been a really good performing asset over the last 3 years.
Representative Baer?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. He just answered my question, so thank you.
All right, great. All right, thank you. I think we'll move on. Yeah, Representative Nicholas?
And so the logic of retirement in acquiring gold is basically a hedge on other markets. And so you have the ability to buy low, sell high. That's the whole purpose. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Nicholas, yeah, that's correct. It gives us flexibility to adjust the portfolio.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to Senate File 191. Do we have Mr. LeBlanc?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Norman LeBlanc. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the State Treasurer's Office. And I'm speaking with regard to SF 0191 and its implementation. For us, this was incredibly straightforward. In fact, STO has been operating in accordance with SF 0191 and will continue to do so. STO's investment objective is been to achieve the highest risk-adjusted total return, consistent with 191. Only pecuniary factors are considered, again, consistent with 191. And proxies are voted in accordance with the requirements of the statute. And proxy votes are already published on the Treasurer's website semi-annually. So from an implementation perspective, there was very little to do. We will add one column to the report, and that is all. We thank the legislature for passing a bill that allows STO to continue to provide strong performance that results in significant cash flows to the general fund. We also thank the legislature for providing some funding for this effort. We expect to reclassify an existing open position, and with this funding, hire a junior level staff member to assist in the areas of proxy voting and compliance. With that, I would be happy to stand for any questions.
Questions for Mr. LeBlanc? This was Senator Beitman's bill. All right, seeing none, we'll go back to the retirement system. Director Swindell.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, again, Dave Swindell from the retirement system. The first thing that the board has done to implement Senate File 191, and first, we've always instructed our managers to vote our shares in the strict financial interest of the system in accordance with the state constitution and 401A, exclusive benefit to the members. But we have slightly modified the IPS, which is in your packet, to include some specific language out of 191, just so you know. And so it's on page 5, it's paragraph 9, proxy voting requirements. And this is important because each manager, as we do a contract with them, is required to obey the retirement board's investment policy statement. So here's what it says about proxy voting. The board has the duty to provide management oversight for voting proxies of all investments held in the retirement account. The board has authorized the investment staff to hire a proxy voting service provider to assist in managing proxy voting and reporting. Any proxy voting service retained by WRS shall submit semi-annual reports of its activity to the board. Investment managers will be asked annually to confirm in writing with compliance with the policy. WRS shall instruct its investment managers to vote proxies on behalf in a manner that is in the best financial interest of WRS beneficiaries and consistent with obtaining the highest total return on a risk-adjusted basis. Proxy voting decisions made by investment managers on behalf of WRS shall only be based on pecuniary factors without regard to furthering environmental, social, governance, political, or ideological interests that do not maximize total return. Investment managers shall execute all proxies in a timely fashion and provide WRS, either directly or through its retained proxy voting service provider, a full accounting of all proxy votes, including a written explanation of individual voting decisions upon request. So that's now incorporated. Some of this exact same language is incorporated from the bill into the investment policy statement, which will now be incorporated into the contracts with our investment managers. So this turns out to be kind of an interesting issue. Let me introduce Josh Keefe on my left, your right. Josh is one of the people who was authorized 2 years ago to have the first operations support for the investment staff. We had 7 investment professionals, but nobody doing all the administration. And the administration on $11.5 billion operation is pretty big. And so it was farmed out amongst the analysts and some other non-investment folks. We finally got authority to hire 2 people as an operations staff, and Josh Keefe is our first investment operations manager. We are investigating a proxy voting service because although we've always had this similar guidance to our managers, our reporting of it, even to ourselves and let alone to the legislature and to the public, we're behind Treasury in that regard. That has just been a fact. So we're going to fix that. The bill requires us to fix it. We're going to do it. One of the things we're doing is investigating some proxy voting services. So we have a request for proposals that's out. And I'd ask Josh to update us and the committee on where we are with that process.
All right, Mr. Keefe?
All right. Thanks, Dave. Madam Committee Chair, members of the committee. Josh Keefe, Investment Operations Manager with the Wyoming Retirement Service. As Dave alluded to, the RFP went out live on May 28th. The window closes on June 27th for proposals to be received. We've already received a couple of questions from some of the big players in the industry. There are really 2 big players that control roughly 95% of the market for this service. And but there are a couple of other ones too that have expressed interest in submitting a proposal. So those responses to their questions, all the questions are due tomorrow, Friday, and then we will get responses to them next week for those. And so with that, the goal is to really have the contract negotiated and the service in place on or about September 1st of this year. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any more questions.
All right, any questions? Representative Wasserberger?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, thank you.
Maddie, Committee Chair, Representative Wasserberger, are you regarding specifically the RFP? Is that what you're asking? Or are you asking about, I guess I'm not fully understanding your question.
Representative?
Madam Chair, thank you. For shareholders, so for proxy voting, I guess that was what I understood. There is a website where you guys have the proposals of shareholder proposals for things to vote on for proxy voting. And so with that clarification, is anyone in the public able to go to that website and propose a shareholder proposal and then just
So Representative, I think I'll help answer this. Senate File 191 concerned the requirement for the state's investment policies to have limitations. And so in order to implement those limitations, the Wyoming retirement system is hiring a vendor essentially to fulfill those requirements associated with those limitations. So they prepared a request for proposal from potential vendors who would then evaluate those investments to ensure they met those limitations. And so they're currently seeking vendors to provide that service to the Wyoming retirement system, which was unrelated, I think, to your question concerning shareholder proxy voting, concerning our investments. So this would be a vendor that would evaluate our investments to ensure that they comply with the requirements in Senate File 191. Representative Baer?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Similar question. It was just stated by the Treasurer's Office that very little change took place once the bill was in place. But one of the requirements is that a website actually show those votes, what they were about, all the data that you just mentioned that you're going to be collecting. They have a website that gives much of that information. They got to make some tweaks on that. But do you have a website also that the public can see what the proxy votes were, what their decisions were, and why?
Madam Chairman, Representative Baer, no, not yet.
Okay.
We will get there. That's the purpose of this. Those websites where you do see, I've looked at several other pension plans that are ahead of us in this regard. I mean, this is just an improvement we got to make. With all that is displayed, typically what happens is there's a link on the retirement systems website that says if you want to look at our proxy voting or investment program, click here. It takes you away from the pension systems website to the vendor's website that's doing the proxy voting, and they have it displayed, sometimes with the logo of the pension system, but you're not on the pension system's website, but there's a link to it, and that's typically how people can review it. And that's probably what we will do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What is that website, just so I can quickly jot it?
They're still working on it.
Oh, okay.
Our website is retirement.wyo.gov. And we would put a link on that. There's a section on the website on our investment program. We'll put a link on it, which will go to our proxy service provider, and they'll have all this information displayed for our system. It's a fairly substantial job. Josh, maybe you can help me out here. I mean, we looked at it one time, and I think it's in the RFP, of how many companies were actually invested in at any given time worldwide.
Sure.
Mr. Keefe?
Yeah. Madam Committee Chair, members of the committee. So as of March 31st, we currently have 4,658 individual companies that sit inside the portfolio. And so if you figure roughly 10 proxy votes per holding, that's 47-ish thousand votes every year. And so can be very intense. As Dave alluded to, he and I looked at the CalPERS website, which is the California Public Employees Retirement System. It is very intense. You go to the website, you can type in whatever company that they may have inside their portfolio, and then you can even filter it through by date, by the specific meeting. The vendor that provides CalPERS, that service, is one of the two big ones in the country. And so, but just like Dave said, There's a link on the CalPERS website. You then go to the vendor's website that is directly related to that specific institution and how they vote those proxy votes.
All right, Senator Guru?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I don't want it now because I don't want to tip our hand, but once this process is over, once the boards finish this process, it'd be helpful to get what the cost is for this service. So we could, once again, so we can evaluate. I mean, it is, 191 is the law, this is the way you all are going through it, but it'd be nice to know what the cost is for this project. I mean, that's, you know, as you say, 4,000 companies, it's going to be a bit of it's a job, so it's going to have some cost to it. So it'd be nice to see that number.
Yeah, Senator Nethercott, Senator Guru, we will do that. I think one of the good things about Senate File 191 is this was not an unfunded requirement. It did contain an appropriation in the form of a basis point. 1 basis point can be contributed to this. I think that's generous. What we will do from a budgetary standpoint, just so you know, we'll get a contract, we'll find out exactly what this is going to cost, and then we'll submit a proposal through the governor's office to adjust our budget by just exactly that amount. It's going to be less than 1 basis point. I think probably a quarter at most.
Senator Guru?
Just a follow-up comment, because something that was said there, I want to make sure I get it right. What I heard the Treasurer's Office say is that they haven't had to make too many changes based on 191. They've made a lot of changes before that as far as their investment policy. That was the culmination of very robust discussions that we were all involved with. I know I'm watching the SLIB board, there were very long discussions, very robust discussions over the past few years in tweaking that investment policy statements based on ESG principles, and it's been the subject of legislation that we've all debated. So there's been a lot go into it. So 191's passage just kind of dovetail with a lot of the evolution of this that the Treasurer's Office brought to this, which has been, like I say, fully vetted. So I just want to make sure that this is something that was easy for them. It wasn't easy for any of us, but it's been a fruitful exercise. Thank you.
Representative Storer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm curious to do a slightly deeper dive on how the vendors interpret the criteria that SF 191 gave them in terms of how they should vote the proxies. And I'm curious whether that's some of the questions that they're coming back to us with in order to clarify how they actually do go about determining how they meet that criteria. Thank you.
Mr. Keefe, Director?
Madam Chairman, Representative Storer, these services typically operate on a couple of different levels. One, they have a kind of a standard slate of philosophies, and you can pick one of those and say that philosophy is pretty much in guidance with ours, or you can get a customized thing, and they'll vote it exactly the way we do. The costs differ. How much they will differ is a point of negotiation, and I don't know how that's going to turn out. I suspect that one of their off-the-shelf philosophies will work because there's other entities like us that have similar investment beliefs. It may just be fine, but we'll have to evaluate that. They do have the ability to vote our shares independently.
All right, any additional questions? Senator Beitman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That kind of answers my question I was going to ask, but, are they advisory only or are they binding? And you just said in some instances, they just vote our shares. It's a little concerning because I know Glass Lewis and ISS are still all in on ESG, despite all the pushback from states like Wyoming, Texas, and others. What assurances do we have that they're going to follow through with this and actually implement this?
Yeah, Madam Chair. So all these services have sort of, Madam Chair, Senator Beitman, they all have sort of their standard menu of maximizing value. And they aren't going to violate that because they would be sued and there'd be substantial reputational damage. So we can count on that. And I think that through this statute, we'll be able to provide more transparency, which I think will get everybody more comfortable. But this isn't going to influence what our managers are doing because they're already voting in the best financial interests of the retirement system. But I think the transparency will be helpful to prove that to everybody.
Any additional questions concerning Senate File 191? All right, any other comments from the public? All right, seeing none, we'll close Senate File 191.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Just appreciate the legislature's support of an operations staff. Josh is on board. Thank you very much. When did you meet?
Committee, as an aside, I'm just going to take a point of privilege here. We heard 2 pieces of testimony from the Treasurer's Office on the retirement system concerning bids out for contract that they're negotiating and concerns about market manipulation for how the taxpayers could be disadvantaged as a result of releasing that information. I applaud the Treasurer's Office and the retirement system for being aware of those concerns and acting in the taxpayers' interests concerning those negotiations. Interestingly, however, Wyoming statutes do not afford those protections. And so there's only one protection for executive session concerning that, and that's for the purchase of real estate, and only if the government entity can prove it would cause an increase in price. And so there's also no exception in the Public Records Act. So I'd like to just prime you for the need to provide those protections for the taxpayers' interests for contracts in negotiation, in addition to real estate, in our sunshine laws in Wyoming, because I do think they're deficient. I know our fourth arm of government is very much resistant to that, but you can see here prime examples of the utility for the effective operation of government to provide those protections during the negotiation phases. With that, thanks for letting me comment, and we will go on to Senate File 145, Local Government Investment in Equities. Thank you, Mr. Fuller.
Madam Chairman, this is 4-07, a copy of the bill and your reading materials. As background, in 2022, the people adopted a constitutional amendment which authorizes the legislature to provide for the investment of funds belonging to local governments in stocks and equities, contingent upon a 2/3 vote of each house of the legislature. In 2024, the legislature enacted a bill to establish a third investment pool that would be operated and overseen by the state treasurer's office to provide for the investment of local government funds in stocks and equities. This act, Madam Chairman and members of the committee, Senate File 145, authorizes local governments, and these are cities, towns, counties, and special districts, to directly invest in stocks and equities. The local government making these investments would bear the risk of making the investments in stocks and equities. Before doing so, a local government must first establish an investment advisory board that provides advice and expertise on local governments' investments in stocks and equities. The State Loan and Investment Board, in turn, is required to adopt investment policy statements for local government investments in stocks and equities. SLIB is required to have these statements be comparable to the requirements and conditions for the state's investments of public funds in similar investments. The investments that local governments make in stocks and equities must comply with all State Loan and Investment Board adopted investment policy statements that are applicable to local government investing. And no political subdivision can directly invest in stocks and equities until SLIB adopts these required statements. That's a basic overview of this bill, and happy to answer questions.
Questions for Mr. Fuller? Let's go, little Bill. I see we have Ms. Anderson here from the governor's office. I know she's been reviewing these rules. Perhaps we could hear from her and provide some comments. And committee members, you heard from the executive director for the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. She provided us an email recognizing that it's still very preliminary in the process, and they hope to provide more robust feedback at a later date. But with that, Ms. Anderson, welcome.
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Betsy Anderson, and I am Governor Gordon's Deputy Chief of Staff and General Counsel. So I just want to update you. The chairman of the State Loan and Investment Board, Governor Gordon, asked if I would coordinate with the board's investment consultant, RVK, to start this process to present, to have them recommend language for the board's investment policy for the investment of local governments and equities. And so at this point in the process, RVK has provided a draft. I have shared that, the request of RVK. They wanted to have some stakeholder comment. Obviously, there'll be public comment at a board meeting, but they like to have those comments in advance to make a thoughtful review of those and address any comments. And so we're in the process. I did send the proposed language, initial draft, to the County Commission Association and to the Wyoming Association of Municipalities. I did also send it to the Treasurer's Office. Did not share it with all the board members. As you know, they cannot collaborate outside of a public meeting, so did not do that. And so we're getting comments now, and the hope is that it will be presented to the board at the August meeting for them to vote.
All right, questions for Ms. Anderson? Seeing none, I see we have Mr. Riemann here from the County Commissioners Association. Any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of Wyoming's County Commissioners. My counterpart at the Association of Municipalities did send her regards via email and also asked me to express her apologies that she couldn't be here. They are hosting their summer meeting as we speak. I want to thank you all collectively. I want to thank the Governor's Office, the Treasurer's Office for working with us on this particular issue. As you've heard, we have received draft rules, and I'm very appreciative of those. I am not an expert in this field whatsoever. In fact, my wife does the investments in our house, and I'm very happy that she does that and proud of what she does. But we will be working with commissioners, with county treasurers and others to make sure that we get robust feedback to the Governor's Office and RVK as part of this process. Just for your edification, these rules will go into Section 21 of the state's current framework, which already exists for local governments, in particular corporate bonds and some other investment strategies, and the limitations that we have around this. So we'll just be expanding that particular area of current state rules and law. I will say that it's our understanding we are moving towards the August meeting of SLIB, and we're appreciative of that. There was some discussion that it might happen more immediate, and frankly, we appreciate the additional time to get this right. Once they're adopted, we will take very seriously as an association a responsibility to collaborate with county treasurers, county commissioners, so that they understand this responsibility. It's a serious responsibility. It's one that comes with an opportunity, but also restrictions, and we want to be very clear about what that looks like. So with that, Madam Chairwoman, appreciate the work that is ongoing, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Mr. Riemann, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Riemann? All right, seeing none, we appreciate seeing you. Any public comment? Nothing online? Representative Bear.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It appears we're on the last bill and we finished that discussion. I'd like to actually, if we could, go back to the first discussion and just kind of expand on it just slightly regarding the trust funds. And in regards to past legislation, we had some legislation that passed the House in the last session that brought this same concept into our permanent mineral trust fund and our school foundation land fund.
Do you have a bill number, maybe?
Yes, House Bill 270 and House Bill 271.
And those are titled?
Spending policy, so they have to do with our charter in spending policy, but they have to do with those two major accounts. And what I'd like to do is just hear a little bit of testimony about opportunity cost for the length of, any particular length of time that we go on without adjusting that spending policy.
Did those bills pass?
They passed the House.
Okay. I think today we'll only talk about bills that we passed and put in. We can talk about maybe having an opportunity to relook at those on the agenda later, so staff is prepared to evaluate that and provide accurate information. So how about if we put it on our next agenda?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate that. I did share this opportunity with staff, and I do believe they have some information and a memo available for the committee if you'd like.
Great. Well, we are going to break for lunch. I'll give staff the opportunity to have a lunch break to present on that after, because we certainly have plenty of time after lunch to review those briefly. I just have concerns it's also not on the agenda for the public to listen in and understand what's there. So I am adverse to surprise items on the agenda, both for the committee members to be apprised as well as staff. So we'll take about 5 to 10 minutes after lunch to hear a brief overview on those bills from staff, and that's about all we'll allocate for the day. So with that, we will break for lunch now and come back at 1:30. Committee members, as a reminder, we heard some testimony that the Wyoming Association of Municipalities is having their summer convention over at East High School, and you're welcome to attend. A member of this committee testified on a panel there this morning. Another member will be testifying over the lunch hour, and a lot of legislators are there interfacing with our local government officials, and so I know you're all welcome to attend that at East High School. So with that, we will come back at 1:30 with that limitation of that new agenda item, allowing folks in the public a little bit of time to understand that new agenda item we've just added ad hoc. Meeting adjourned till 1:30, or recessed.